Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Iris packed her things and scolded herself for not listening to the people around her for so long. For more than a year now, she had been getting hints from one acquaintance or another that Gregory was cheating. She absolutely did not want to believe it. Only when Anne's best friend showed a video of her husband openly embracing and kissing a young blonde in a restaurant, after which they left together in a taxi, Iris believed it. That night her spouse didn't come home for the night, citing protracted negotiations, which had happened quite often lately. They had been married for almost 10 years. Everything started out very romantically. Iris at that time studied at the Art Institute and loved to go to the seafront to write from life. On one such day, a young man approached her, timidly held out a bouquet of daisies and said, "I have been watching you for a long time. When you paint, everything around you just shines. Can I be near you for a while?" That day, Gregory went to see her off, and already at the hostel proposed. "Let's meet tomorrow and I'll show you my favorite place. I think you'll like it." Since the next day was a day off, Iris agreed without expecting herself. She liked the handsome, brown-eyed brunette from the first moment she saw him, and she was glad to meet him again. They spent the whole next day together, walking through an unusually beautiful park on the outskirts of the city with a small lake and swans. They didn't have to look for topics of conversation. It all worked itself out. Gregory was a part-time student. At the end of the day, as he walked her out again, Anne caught herself thinking that she didn't want to part with him at all. It was the first time this had happened to Iris, and she was even a little frightened by the feelings. But the guy turned out to be very tactful and attentive, literally swamped her with flowers. And 6 months later, when Iris was preparing to defend her diploma, he proposed. She looked fearfully at Gregory and timidly asked, "What about your mum?" "I don't think Mrs. Helen will be happy about the news. She doesn't like me." Gregory smiled, kissed her, and replied gently, "The main thing is that I love you, and will manage with Mum." The fact was that Mrs. Helen had met her with hostility the first day her son brought her to introduce the girl to her. "You, my dear, you seem to be from the provinces with no home. And you're hoping to stay with us. We don't have much room here ourselves." Tears came to her throat, but Iris didn't explain that she lived in a hostel because her parents' house had burned down a few years ago. It was a terrible fire. Everyone said that the neighbor had set the fire. He had some old scores with her father, which nobody knew about. In that terrible fire, everything was burnt to the ground, and my parents were left forever under the rubble. She was lucky enough to be away in the country that weekend. That was the only thing that saved her. Long after her grandfather died, his house became her only inheritance, although they had offered good money for it more than once. The house itself was small, but it was located in a picturesque place. Right behind the gate began the river, which had a lot of fish. Grandfather adored these places, so he bequeathed to keep the house as a memory, and she categorically refused to sell it. True, and went there not often. Future mother-in-law several times tried to dissuade her son from this marriage, saying that the village beggar cannot make him happy. But Gregory said no more. "Mum, I love Iris very much, and I'm going to marry her, no matter what you say. Please don't threaten me with not coming to the wedding. We weren't going to make a big fuss about it. And the day of the wedding, if you feel like it, come straight to the registry office." "Well, no, then it's your decision. I'm sorry." Mrs. Helen came, of course, but both at the registry office and later in the small cozy cafe where they had arranged a festive dinner, sat with a face as if she had not married her son, but was burying him. Over the years, Iris and her mother-in-law had never been able to communicate. She always pretended to tolerate her, and Iris didn't really want a close relationship. After the wedding, she and Gregory moved into a rented one-bedroom flat. Their relationship was perfect. Her husband plunged headlong into business and was at work all day long. At weekends, they were as happy as children. They could lie in bed until noon, watching their favorite films, or they could pack up in 5 minutes and go to friends in the country. Iris was only worried about the fact that she couldn't find a job after the institute for a long time. Her skills turned out to be of no use to anyone, and she had no other skills than drawing. At the same time, she loved to spend time at the canvas and tried to return to this activity at least once in a while, and also very much wanted a baby. But having lived 2 years in marriage, nothing turned out. To which only specialists she did not turn, what analyses she did not take. The verdict was the same. They all said that there were no obvious health problems, but they would probably not have children with Gregory. When Iris learnt this, she thought about it and proposed to her spouse. The doctor said that we probably can't have a baby yet. Let's take the baby from the orphanage. Gregory immediately rejected the suggestion. We don't want a baby that we don't know about. You have to realize there could be any genes in there. We have to have our own baby, just our own baby that we can both be sure of. After that conversation, Iris withdrew into herself. There was nothing she wanted to do, nothing that pleased her. She literally lived like a robot. They began to talk less and less with Gregory and spent less and less time together. The unexpected visit of her mother-in-law added to her distress, as if deliberately timing the moment when Gregory would not be at home. She came without a call, without warning, starting the conversation right from the doorstep. By this time, they had already bought a spacious flat in the center, but not fully furnished. Walking through the rooms, the mother-in-law grinned, and without even turning round, said, "God, if only they had called me to help furnish. It's completely tasteless." Iris wanted to say that the gilt, crystal, and other tinsel in her house did not suit them at all, but she decided not to make a fuss and offered her tea. She herself went to the kitchen. Putting the kettle on, she turned to her mother-in-law and, trying to speak as gently as possible, asked, "Are you here on business or just to check up on me? Gregory won't be in until 9 o'clock today." Without letting her finish, Mrs. Helen continued in a commanding voice, "I've had some unpleasant news from my son. Not only can't you give birth, but you're going to take the son of some alcoholic or worse from the orphanage. Tell me, are you even in your right mind?" Hardly restraining herself, Iris quietly replied, "Well, first of all, what makes you think it will be a son? It could be a girl. And secondly, in orphanages, there are a lot of wonderful children from perfectly healthy parents." Her mother-in-law waved angrily at her. "Oh, I beg you, don't talk rubbish. Normal children are all with their parents and families." Then, suddenly changing from anger to mercy, she said a little more quietly, "Listen, there is another, quite normal way to get a child since you cannot give birth yourself, surrogacy. Have you heard anything? Yeah, it's new. Yeah, it may not be legal or expensive in this country yet, but I think Gregory would rather have the money than raise some foundling." Iris tried to explain that she'd already heard about this option, but as it was too risky, she refused. Her mother-in-law didn't want to hear anything, just kept saying the same thing. "Of course you will find a lot of reasons just to do everything to me and my son despite me." Abruptly stood up from the chair, she went to the exit, and turning around at the door, with hatred slightly audible, hissed, "I told my son not to marry you. You spoil his whole life. You sit on everything ready, and someone else's child on his neck. You want to hang him." The mother-in-law left with a loud slam on the door, and Iris cried with resentment into her pillow all evening. When her husband returned, she was already asleep, and the next day decided not to tell her husband about the arrival of his mother. But she had already decided for herself that she would definitely take a child from the baby home. The first thing she started to do was to look for a job. I did not want to hear the reproaches of my mother-in-law that she lives at the expense of her husband. A fortunate variant turned up. The same friend Anne suggested it. When she heard that Iris had decided to go back to work, she said excitedly, "Just today I saw an advert on our doorstep that a renovation and construction company is looking for a designer. Where can I go? I have no experience in this field, no knowledge," Iris said sadly in response. But her friend did not stop. "You what? Don't you want a job? You're not going to be a salesman, are you? It's like painting beautiful pictures or designing modern renovations." In the end, that day her friend convinced her to call the advertising phone number. The work turned out to be not difficult, and besides very creative, which was to Iris's liking. Her favorite job seemed to breathe life into her. She struggled but managed to persuade Gregory to take the baby. And 6 months later, Andrew was born in their home. Even at that moment, it seemed to Iris that happiness and joy settled in their home again. But it turned out that the appearance of a son, a curly-haired boy with not childishly clever eyes, was a happiness only for her. She looked after the baby on the first day, as soon as she came to the baby house, and he seemed to recognize her as a kindred spirit. The baby literally did not come off her hands, gently hugging her neck with his little hands, and was ready to sit for hours on end. "Why do you run after him all day long?" indignant husband. But she continued to treat the child like a treasure. Gregory was always unhappy about something. Never once showed towards his son, so necessary to him, affection and tenderness. It was frustrating at first. Iris tried to bring them together in every possible way. She organized trips to the countryside and just small holidays at home. But then she realized that it was useless, so she put up with it. She tried, as best she could, to compensate for the child's lack of love from his father, giving the boy as much attention as possible. Fortunately, her job allowed her to work remotely most of the time, designing projects for custom home and flat renovations. It was at that time that she adjusted herself so that the main thing for her was to take care of her son and work, and began to pay less and less attention to the moods and antics of her husband. Gregory gave her less and less money each time, explaining that the business required constant investments. If she had known then what kind of business he was investing their money in, she would have left even then. But Iris believed him to the last. Anne's video had opened her eyes. She would have continued to keep the family home while her husband entertained young girls in hotels. Her resentment was overwhelming, but the decision had been made. It was a pity to destroy something, but in her heart she admitted to herself that they hadn't had a family as such for several years. It was time to put a stop to it. She finally decided to do it. Especially at work, too, problems began to arise. When she'd started there, the firm had been run by Mr. Samuel, who was just over 60 at the time. A fine, tactful, intelligent manager, he created all the necessary conditions for them. But 6 months ago, things changed dramatically. The boss suffered a stroke, after which he decided to retire from business, and in his place he put an insolent, spoiled son. Matthew himself has not yet done anything in his life, but he has already got well into the role of the boss. Arrogantly and rudely handed out commands, many of which were impossible to fulfill without even looking into the essence of the issues. He began to fine employees one after another without trying to explain the reasons. And all these deductions of wages were more like levies than fines. The staff tried to be indignant, but the new manager, smirking cheekily, said at the meeting, "If someone is not satisfied with something, I can offer to go to the labor exchange, and not to blow my brains out. There will always be someone to take your place." Iris realized that after all these deductions from her salary, she would not be able to live alone with her son and rent a flat. She decided to go to the house left by her grandfather. A few hours later, when the sun was about to disappear from the horizon, they got off the bus in a small village. Her heart snapped at the memories that came flooding back. After all, this was where her childhood had been. This was where she tried to return to every summer. This is where she had come, weeping with grief when her parents died. Now to a place so dear to her, the only place she could return to, she came running away from the past. Looking around, as if recognizing familiar places anew, Iris sighed and, taking her son's hand, said, "Well, my friend, shall we go and settle into our nest?" "What are we birds? Is our nest made of straw?" "Am I your chick?" asked the boy enthusiastically. Now somehow she felt warm and peaceful. After all, she had someone to live for. She smiled and, patting her son on his curly head, replied, "Come on, little bird, you'll see for yourself. I hope you like it. When I was your age, I loved this house." Grandfather's house was almost at the other end of the village, and the suitcase was too heavy to carry. The distance, which could have been traveled in 15 minutes, took them almost 40. However, on the way they stopped at a shop. They had to buy some groceries. When they reached the house, dusk had fallen almost completely to the ground, and Iris could see a glow in one of the windows. She knew for a fact that no one else could get into this house but her. She was the only heiress. There were no other relatives left. It was true that her grandfather had left the keys to a neighbor just in case, but there was no reason for her to go in there now. "Son, please sit here on the bench. I'll see if everything's all right in the house. I'll fire up the stove, and then I'll come straight back for you," said Iris. And leaving her suitcase beside him, she went to the porch. The door was open. She slipped quietly into the corridor. There were male voices in one of the rooms, but the speech was not English. As she listened, Iris realized that the uninvited guests were speaking pure French, but how foreigners could have got into her house was unclear. At that moment, she was glad that she had studied French at school with great zeal and had even traveled to competitions in this subject. Without much difficulty, she made out how one of the strangers had said, "The nature is magnificent, and the house is built for centuries. Invest a little money, and it would be easy to rent this property for a lot of money to all lovers of quiet country holidays." His interlocutor immediately responded enthusiastically, "The lake alone is worth it. You can get your money back in a few months. If we inform our people, we'll have a year's worth of bookings. It's true that all the furniture should be thrown out and new ones should be bought, but a little renovation too. That doesn't hide the antiquity of the building." Iris couldn't stand it and opened the door with a jerk and flew into the room like a whirlwind. She was literally seething with indignation, jumping up to the strangers. Iris, in French, became indignant. "Could someone at least explain to me what's going on here? Not only did you sneak into my house, but you're making plans. Do you know how old this furniture is? I, like you, wasn't even alive." The foreigners, who appeared to be twins a little older than Iris, looked at her in surprise, as if afraid to say a word, but she was unstoppable. "You've somehow managed to trespass on private property. You're sitting here, talking, making plans. Is it all right that I'm the only owner?" she exhaled and said in a calmer voice. "And now my son and I are tired. And please leave the house. Otherwise I'll call the police." "We'll wait outside." As she was about to leave, Iris heard a timid voice behind her. "I'm sorry, there's no need to call the police. It's not our fault. This house was sold to us by the chairman. As you say, at a bargain price. He hasn't given us the documents yet, but he promised to issue them." Iris looked at the foreigners. No matter how decent they looked, she didn't want to spend the night in the same house with two strange men. The guests, as if understanding her look, looked at each other, and one said, apologizing, "I'm sorry, we won't intrude. There is a house with dry grass in the yard. We'll spend the night there, and in the morning we'll go deal with the chairman." Iris smiled. "We call that house the barn. There's hay in there. I'll bring you some blankets there. By the way, you sleep very well there." The foreigners did not strike her as crooks. On the contrary, it was obvious that the young men were well brought up and felt very awkward in the situation. They spent the night in the hayloft. When Iris awoke at the crack of dawn, they were apparently still sound asleep. Andrew, too, evidently tired from last night's journey, had not awakened once during the night, and putting his little hands under his cheeks, was sleeping sweetly. Iris decided to make breakfast while everyone was asleep. She had bought everything she needed for pancakes the night before. Her son liked them with jam in the morning, and Iris knew there was plenty of that left at her grandfather's house. Just as she finished baking the last pancake, she heard soft male voices in the courtyard. Trying to remain inconspicuous, she looked out the window and saw the twins taking a bucket from the well and taking turns washing themselves, pouring water on each other. The kettle boiled, splashing drops from the spout under the cooker. Iris switched it off when she heard the hiss and poured boiling water into the kettle, immediately transferring the jam from the jar into a vase. Putting half the pancakes on a separate plate, she carried it all outside. Off to the side of the porch was the gazebo where she and her grandfather used to sit. Iris headed there, calling out to the guests. "Good morning. Here, I brought you some breakfast. Sorry, tea and pancakes. Eat with jam." The foreigners shouted in broken English, "Thank you." Then she saw through the window with what pleasure they were eating pancakes. She grinned and said, "They're not croissants. but it looks like you're pretty hungry." Looking at the clock, she decided to wake her son. The little boy got up in a great mood and, smelling his favorite smell, without getting dressed, rushed to the kitchen. "Where are you running?" "Let's go wash up." Laughing, Iris managed to shout after him, but Andrew was already sending a whole pancake into his mouth, covering his eyes with pleasure. As they were eating breakfast, one of the foreigners appeared in the doorway, holding out an empty plate and cups. "Thank you very much. It was very tasty. My brother and I are going to go to the chairman now and find out." "Wait 5 minutes. I'll change my clothes and come with you." Iris took the dishes from his hands and, turning to her son, added, "Andrew, stay home for half an hour. I'll be back and forth in no time." The son, filling his mouth with pancakes, nodded. Iris went to get dressed. When the three of them went into the village hall, the secretary tried to lie that the chairman wasn't in, but one of the brothers interrupted her sharply. "Don't lie. Yesterday he gave us a lift in the car that is now at the door." The man turned sharply and after a second jerked open the door of the neighboring office. Iris noted to herself at that moment that the brothers were alike only in appearance, but in behavior and temperament they were completely different. The one who entered the study first was more decisive and active. He had been the first to start the conversation in the house the previous evening. Here, too, he went on the offensive. On seeing the visitors, the chairman fidgeted with some papers on the table, and without raising his eyes, said, "I have an appointment by appointment. Please go out. I don't have time for your questions." At that moment, he apparently didn't recognize Iris. It wasn't surprising, since the last time she had been here had been the year of her grandfather's funeral. As it happened, she hadn't been able to come for the next 4 years. Then, Iris couldn't stand it any longer and, coming to the table, literally snatched the papers out of his hands, threw them and said menacingly, "And the question is not ours, but yours. Explain how you managed to sell my house to these foreign gentlemen. Maybe I gave you a power of attorney for this, or some other reason." The chairman, recognizing her, was frightened, blushed, and began to speak in a trembling voice. "It's your own fault, isn't it? I haven't heard a word from you for years. I thought the hut had become derelict." Iris was literally overflowing with anger, and trying to calm down, she said, "Well, I'm not going to have any trouble with you. I'm just going to file a police report right now." Turning round, she walked past the foreigner standing at the door towards the exit. But at that moment, the obese chairman flew towards her and, blocking the way, began to speak quickly. "Please listen to me first. There's no need for any police. I didn't take this money for myself. Our school is falling apart. If it is not repaired this year, the children will have to go to the neighboring village. There's no funding. There's no bus to transport school children either. Okay, it's autumn, but imagine how these unfortunate people will get to classes 80 kilometers away in winter." Looking pleadingly at Iris, he said, as if apologizing, "Here I thought that your house, since no one wants it. It's been so long since anyone showed up it can be used. I'm sorry, but most of the money's gone, of course. I almost immediately ordered everything I needed for the renovation, but you can pick up the building materials." After listening to the chairman, Iris didn't say anything, just silently walked out of the office. On the one hand, she understood him, but on the other hand, she felt sorry for the foreigners too. It seemed that after buying the house from the chairman, they had already made plans, and Iris had disrupted them. The twins stayed in the office after they left and returned only about 40 minutes later. During that time, a great idea had occurred to her. Iris immediately decided to share it with her guests. The three of them sat down in the gazebo and the conversation began. "You know, I thought your plan that I overheard, I'm sorry to say, could be implemented on the first day. The house next to the main house is a large summer kitchen. My grandfather built it before the house was even built, so it can be converted into a living space. I need a place to live too, and the main one could be converted into something you were planning to rent out." The brothers looked at each other in bewilderment, and Iris got up and went into the house. In a couple of minutes, she came back with paper and a pencil and began to draw something quickly. And soon a plan began to emerge on the paper. Having explained in detail the scheme of rearrangement, she began to wait for an answer from them. The men looked at her drawings with delight for a few minutes, and then Kevin smiled and said, "You are an amazing woman. How did you do it so quickly?" "We agree." In response, Iris took the sketches and said, "Only I have one condition. I have to be a co-founder in this business." Surprisingly, the foreigners agreed to her terms, and from the next day they began to develop a detailed plan of reconstruction. All the design issues fell entirely on Iris's shoulders, and she was happy to show the options to her companions, which made them more and more delighted each time. "Iris, you are incredibly talented," Austin said with admiration. "Brother, you have my full support," he always added, "very beautiful and very talented." Iris began to notice that both brothers liked her. They tried to give her every possible sign of attention and to be near her as often as possible. A few times she even overheard them fighting over her, but at that moment she didn't care at all. Not only was she head over heels in preparation for the renovation, but she also had to find time to deal with her son. The main problem that she wanted to solve as soon as possible was the divorce. After she disappeared without saying anything, her husband had called several times. Iris thought he wanted her back, but it turned out the reason for the calls was completely different. The same friend had called and started to tell her the latest news. Turns out Gregory knew where she'd gone, and then he remembered that his grandfather's house was in the perfect location, and there was a lot of money to be made from it. Can you believe it? "A friend of mine works for that lawyer your husband showed up at," without hiding her emotion, she said. Then, suddenly remembering something, she stopped and asked in surprise, "Only I did not understand. And what other men there with you and the owners appear in the owners?" "Linda, the one who works with your family lawyer, said that he refused him, saying that the case is absolutely not winnable. He said there are 2 other foreigners in the ownership. Is it true you're not alone?" Iris didn't want to say anything yet, not even to her friend, so she just said, "No, it's not what you think. It's just that there's a problem with the title deeds, but I think I'll figure it out. Well, you see, keep in mind, the husband has his eye on your house and seems to be determined," she warned her friend, and promising to come back at the earliest opportunity, said goodbye. At that moment, Iris did not pay much attention to this call, but very soon she remembered again about Gregory's desire to take possession of her grandfather's house. Having been refused the help of a family lawyer, he decided to use another dubious option. After all, he could not accept that such a valuable property, such as a house in a prestigious place, could remain with his wife, and he did not even care about the fact that the property was inherited, and therefore not subject to division in the divorce. Gregory remembered that his mistress had repeatedly boasted that her father was an influential man in criminal circles and could solve any problem. Having received the lawyer's refusal, he decided to talk to her about it. Entering the flat, right from the threshold, he began. "Hi, you told me that your dad is a well-known person in the city. Why don't you introduce me to him?" he began, kissing his mistress's hand. She gave him a sly look and grinned. "Do you want to ask for my hand?" she asked, a little confused. He immediately found himself. "It will definitely happen, honey, just a little later. I'm not divorced yet. In the meantime, your father is needed on a very important matter." When he told Mr. Terrence the next day about his desire to get the house, which can make a lot of money, the eyes of criminal authority lit up. "Well, it's an interesting subject. I think, first of all, I'll send my men there to assess whether the property is as good as you describe it, and then we'll decide how much to charge you for the favor." And the next morning, an expensive foreign car pulled up to Iris's house, out of which got out a 2-meter-tall ambulance in expensive tracksuits. She didn't see it at first, only jumped out onto the porch when there was a commotion in the yard. The brothers, one with a shovel and one with a pitchfork, were pushing the insolent strangers out of the yard. The last thing she heard was the words of one of the guests. "You have no idea who you're messing with, you idiots. You can't even speak English, you can't even speak your own language. You will beg for mercy and personally give up your house." The foreigners, not answering anything, continued to advance on them and stopped only when the car doors slammed shut and the car sped away at full speed. The brothers really had no idea how serious a problem they had started. Iris tried to ask them what was the matter, why these types were coming. But Austin kissed her hand and smiled. "It is quite unnecessary for such a nice lady to know what men talk about. We'll tell you one thing, we won't let you get hurt." In spite of his answer, I felt uneasy. These men, who had been rejected by the foreigners, were very aggressive. Something told her that her husband was involved in their arrival, but there was no proof. Iris thought she liked both brothers very much and feared that if she had to choose, she wouldn't know who to favor. But there was no choice. One day the brothers set off in their car, which they had bought, as they said themselves, for traveling in the countryside, for the city. They needed to have some documents notarized. "It'll only take half an hour," Kevin said, getting into the car and waving to Andrew. He added, "Hang in there. We'll be sure to bring you some presents." But they didn't come back in half an hour, or even 5. Andrew sat on the windowsill waiting for the presents, refusing to get down, and Iris was getting more and more worried by the minute. No one was answering her phone calls, and she didn't understand what could have happened that none of her brothers could even call. Suddenly, it was already around 7 p.m. when her number rang. "Iris, it's the city hospital. We found your phone number in a man's notebook. He was killed in a car accident today." A woman's voice called out Kevin's first and last name. "Could you come down for a lineup?" Iris couldn't tell if the noise was in her head or her ears. She thought she was going to faint in a second. She didn't want to believe what she was hearing, but she had to go. In her shock, she even forgot to ask what was wrong with her other brother. Picking up her son in her arms, Iris quickly ran to her grandmother's neighbor, Nancy, and after briefly explaining what had happened, left her son. In the meantime, she hurried to catch the last bus. Already at the hospital, she learned that the car in which the brothers were traveling had a brake failure. Kevin was killed, and Austin, although alive, was in critical condition. When she approached the intensive care unit, she saw a terrible picture. He was lying there completely motionless, covered in wires and bandages. A nurse who entered the room quietly said, "It's a pity, such a young man, and there is almost no chance of life, only to pray. By the way, if you are a relative, come to the head doctor. He will tell you what you can do to help." Without realizing why, she introduced herself as a bride and ended up with a whole list of necessary medicines for Austin. Finally, the doctor said sadly, "In addition to this list, ideally we need a new machine because we only have a few on the ward. And if your fiancé doesn't regain consciousness soon, we'll be forced to switch it off." Iris was scared to even hear such a thing, and she said quietly but confidently, "I'll buy everything. I'll get everything. Just please save him." When she returned home early in the morning, she began to think about where to get the money needed for treatment. She tried calling people she knew, but they all knew that she and Gregory were getting divorced, so they found 1,000 reasons to refuse. And just when she was about to fall into despair, an expensive foreign car with shaven-headed thugs appeared at her gate again. One went straight into the house. The other 2 stayed on the porch, and right from the threshold, without even saying hello, the big man said, "Well, beautiful. We've heard about it. Trouble, so to speak, has come to the house. Your protectors are no longer protectors, but now you need money to bury one and raise the other. The medicine must be expensive. A single mother can't afford it." The bulky man went into the kitchen and took a biscuit from the vase without asking, put it all in his mouth and continued. "So my brother and I were thinking, we came here to offer you to sell your house, to cure a foreigner with this money, and then you'll have some money to live on." Iris at first wanted to throw the insolent man out, but then thought that maybe it was a chance. After all, the money for Austin's treatment was needed as soon as possible, and there was nowhere to get it. "I need to think about it," Iris said quietly, trying to hold back her tears. "Well, think about it. We'll give you 2 days to think about it. We won't wait any longer, and your fiancé may not live much longer." Iris thought that the stranger's voice was threatening, and for a moment she was afraid not so much for herself as for her son, who was hiding behind her back. After seeing the uninvited guests off, Iris put Andrew to bed and cried in the kitchen for an hour. She was desperately sorry to sell the house. She realized that the brakes had probably been ruined by the same bandits. And so it turned out the brothers were hurt because of her, and now she had to save at least one. In her heart, Iris hoped to find a way out of the situation. She kept calling friends and acquaintances in search of money, but it was all in vain. She even tried to pawn all her jewelry, but in return she was offered an amount that would not even be enough for her medication. Every day, leaving her son at Grandma Nancy's, she traveled to the hospital for a couple of hours, hoping that Austin would regain consciousness, but his condition remained unchanged. Having pawned some of her jewelry after all, she brought the necessary medicines and waited to see if they would make any difference. Exactly 2 days later, as promised, an expensive foreign car drove up to her house again, and the same big man, again without saying hello, threateningly said, "Well, beautiful, have you made up your mind? When are we going to make the deal?" Iris was afraid to raise her eyes at him and timidly said, "I haven't decided yet. Please give me a little more time. After all, this house is all I have left. I need to find my grandfather's will. I don't know where it's gone." She came up with it right off the bat, trying to stall for time. What for, Iris didn't realize. Her refusal literally infuriated the bully. Clenching his fists, he walked up to her and hovered over her like a rock. "Well, I could make you move out of your house for free. But we're not beasts. It's got to be legal. The deadline is a week, and we're not coming back to talk. So that in exactly 7 days you'll be standing on the doorstep with the deeds to the house in your hands." He headed for the exit, and passing by Andrew playing with a machine, said naively affectionately, "What a good boy. Be careful with the car, or they might run you over." The big man looked unequivocally at Iris and silently walked out. Iris ran up to Andrew and held him against her chest. "Don't be afraid, my good man. Everything will be all right. Mom won't let anyone hurt you." Trying to comfort her son, Iris realized that she was very scared, and most importantly, she did not know what to do. The deadline set by the bandits was passing day by day, and there was no other solution. When she had already resigned herself to the fact that in a few days the house would fall into the wrong hands, the unexpected happened. On that day, Iris, as usual, came to see Austin, and as soon as she crossed the threshold, a young nurse ran up to her. "Can you believe it? Your fiancé regained consciousness an hour ago. The doctor said it's a miracle, because everyone thought he wouldn't survive. He asked about his brother, but I couldn't tell him anything. Then he asked me to call you. We were about to call, but you came. Come on, I'll walk you out." Austin smiled weakly when he saw Iris. "Iris, I'm so glad to see you. I was told that you've been coming to see me all the time. Thank you." Iris sat down on the chair next to him and waited for the main question. She did not yet know how she would speak of death and was mentally preparing herself. But suddenly Austin smiled and said, "Can you imagine? I saw Kevin in my dream. He was walking up a golden staircase leading straight up into the clouds. Up until he disappeared behind the fluffy clouds." Iris couldn't take it anymore and covered her face with her hands and sobbed. When she calmed down a little, she removed her palms and, trying not to look at Austin, said quietly, "Kevin's gone. He was killed in that accident, and I think it was those same bastards who set it all up. They came to me afterwards, offering me money for your treatment in exchange for the house." She saw Austin's face go pale, his fists clenched. He lay silent for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. Then, pulling himself together, he said angrily, "I will do anything to avenge my brother. These scoundrels must be punished. Only I'll need your help." Iris brushed away her tears and asked excitedly, "But how can I help you?" Austin explained that there was a video recorder in the car, installed in such a way that it was impossible to find it without knowing. "I think the information from it could help us a lot. Only after that accident, the car is probably in the junkyard by now," Austin said. And with a pleading look at Iris, he added, "Can you find the car? And I'll tell you where the recorder is installed." She didn't know how she was going to do it, but she agreed without hesitation. The next morning she found an address where cars wrecked after an accident are taken. When she arrived, she stood at a loss in front of the junkyard, not knowing where to start. "What brings you to such a place, my daughter? Did you get lost or what?" She heard a hoarse man's voice behind her. She turned around and saw a gray-haired old man dressed in an old military tunic. Without expecting herself, she told him about the accident, about the bandits, about her brother. She added sadly at the end, "And now I have to somehow find this car and get the recorder out of it." The old man came over and, putting a wrinkled palm on her shoulder, said affectionately, "Don't get upset. We will find your missing. I am a former colonel. Officers in trouble do not abandon." Iris thanked fate for her acquaintance with Mr. Ivan, the old man from the dump. If it hadn't been for him, she would never have been able to find the car. Austin looked at the recorder and said indignantly, "Those bastards. That's right, they set up the accident. Now I'm not going to give up until I put them behind bars. The doctor said I'll be discharged soon. But we're not waiting. I know a lawyer. I'll call him, and he'll take the case tomorrow." As if remembering something, Austin looked at Iris. "By the way, you said you want a divorce. Well, he can help you. Believe me, Alex is an excellent specialist, a professional, and you don't have to think about money. I'll help you." Alex was indeed able to prove the guilt of those who had caused the accident quite quickly. Among those who ended up behind bars was the ringleader, the father of Gregory's mistress, which instantly spoilt their relationship. In the divorce proceedings, Alex was also able to make it, so that Gregory didn't even try to allocate a share in the house. Iris was surprised to see her spouse in court, wrinkled shirt, which he hated, bruises under his eyes. There was no trace of the former gloss of a successful businessman. He turned into a tired and exhausted man. Bumping into her in front of the court in the corridor, he literally hissed, "You've ruined my whole life. You're the reason I broke up with Samantha. She hates me now after my father went to prison, and you and that foreigner helped put him away. Samantha's dad took away most of my property because of you, all because you didn't sell them that wretched house." Iris grinned. "It was all your own fault. You wanted to take the last thing my son and I had, so you lost yours. Well, you still have a firm, a business, so go ahead. I hope there's enough money for a new mistress too." Gregory looked at her with the look of a beaten dog. "Those criminal scoundrels have a claim on the firm too. They're going to take the whole thing." "Yeah, but why am I spilling my guts to you? You've only got Andrew, your son, on your mind." Iris didn't say anything else. It was the first time she was so unpleasant to talk to a man with whom she had lived together for so many years. Without another word, she left with the sole wish of never seeing Gregory again. Austin was soon discharged, and they plunged headlong back into the worries of remodeling the house. The changes were noticeable every day. The old cottage was transformed into a real manor house with beautifully carved platebands and columns. A perfectly manicured flower bed appeared at the entrance. One day Austin came in and cheerfully announced, "Iris, you must come with me now. I want to show you something," he said. Iris was surprised, but immediately followed him towards the center of the village. It was only after a few minutes that she realized they were going towards the school. When she went inside, Iris was amazed. All the classrooms had been perfectly renovated. Bright walls, new doors and windows made the room unrecognizable. The chairman came out from somewhere and shook Austin's hand. "Thank you so much. You have no idea what you have done for us, for the village, for the children. We would never have been able to afford such repairs. In September, it will be great to study in such a school for everyone's joy." Iris looked at Austin in surprise and asked quietly, "What does that mean? Can you explain?" But the chairman was ahead of her, enthusiastically informing her. It was Mr. Austin who gave the missing money for the repairs. What's more, he sponsored the whole thing. Iris smiled and said with a sly squint of her eyes, "So, foreigners can help, but we can't. So I swear, as soon as we open our homestead for visitors, I undertake to make monthly contributions to the village council for the improvement of the village, repair of socially important facilities, and also the medical center, the club and the kindergarten should be put in order." Already on the street, she stopped and stood on tiptoe and kissed Austin. "Thank you. You're doing a great job. I'm proud of you." At that moment, it seemed to her that life was finally getting better, but it turned out that not all the troubles were over. When they returned home, they saw a crowd of villagers from afar. The noise was so loud that at first it was impossible to make out anything. But as soon as they got closer, the neighbors started talking about someone trying to set fire to their mansion. It was only at that moment that Iris saw the charred corner of the porch and thought it was lucky she had taken her son to a neighbor. She immediately rushed there, but there was another blow waiting for her. Mrs. Ann, clutching her heart brokenly, tried to find Andrew, looking in every corner. When she saw Iris, she wept and, sinking down on a chair, said faintly, "He was just playing in the yard, and I went inside to warm his soup. When I came out, he was nowhere to be found. Oh, trouble, what is it?" Iris tried to reassure her, but her heart was about to jump out of her chest. She knew that Andrew would never go anywhere without adult permission. She felt a sharp pain in her chest from the foreboding. Austin, having learnt about what had happened, immediately called the district police officer, whose phone number he had taken, just in case, after the first arrival of the bandits. In half an hour, they knew that a man, similar in description to Gregory, holding the boy's hand, was heading towards the river. They rushed there and found the broken rope with which they always tied the boat to the shore. An old man who lived in a house on the bank reported that the boat itself was not there. At that moment, a boy of about 7 years old ran up to them and started pulling them somewhere to the side. "Drowned man. He's wet, lying on the shore, not breathing." Iris felt as if her legs refused to walk, and if she had not been supported by Austin, she would have fallen. She gathered her courage and followed the boy to the shore. Gregory was lying under one of the trees. Iris rushed to him. She grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and shook him as hard as she could. "Where is my son? What have you done with my son, you scoundrel? I'll kill you if anything happens to him." At this moment, she didn't even notice that her ex-husband didn't show any signs of life. Iris sobbed, hitting him wherever she could. Then, realizing that Gregory was dead, she cried out and fell to the ground unconscious. She woke up to a paramedic leaning over her and the whispering of her fellow villagers behind her. A fragment of a phrase that reached her brought her back to reality. A woman's voice spoke softly. What a shock! The foster father had drowned the boy and God had punished the scoundrel. How could anyone trust a child like that? Iris, refusing to believe what was happening, looked pleadingly at Austin, who was sitting beside her on the grass, and he gently stroked her hand. When she closed her eyes, she sobbed in such a way that the women immediately cried, and the men, trying to hold back their emotions, silently clenched their fists. Austin pressed her face to his chest and, rocking back and forth, began to whisper, "Hold on, darling, you're strong. I'll always be there for you. I'll never leave you." But she was as if unconscious, refusing to believe that all this was happening to her. For the next few days, unable to believe Andrew was dead, she kept saying, "Until I see his body, I won't believe it. We'll search both banks downstream every day until we find it." She did not believe she would find her son alive when, on the second day of their search, they came upon a dilapidated fisherman's shack, and a bearded man in worn and sometimes tattered clothes came out to meet them. When he learnt why they had come, he said calmly, "Your boy is alive. He is lying with me. The first day and night he was delirious. Our water is icy, so he caught cold. Now he's been sleeping for 2 hours." Iris was ready to push him away, to run to Andrew, but the master, as if sensing it, said sternly, "Wait, let the boy sleep. You'll have time to see more." It seemed like an eternity to Iris when a sleepy Andrew came out of the cottage. She picked him up in her arms and held him to her chest, crying. The uncomprehending baby only babbled, "Mummy, Mummy, where have you been so long? I missed you so much." "I won't leave you again, my darling, I promise," Iris said quietly. She tried not to leave him with anyone else. A month later, it was announced that the manor was officially open to tourists. Austin, smiling happily, greeted the guests. Andrew was playing with a balloon with a young man in a white t-shirt and jeans, in whom no one would have recognized the bearded tramp who had recently rescued the boy. When all the guests and fellow villagers were assembled, Austin made a solemn speech, after which he asked for another moment of attention and getting down on one knee in front of Iris said, "You are my mate, my woman, my love, and I ask for your hand in public. Marry me." A second silence was broken by applause. "Agree, Iris," came the voices. Holding back tears of joy, she wrapped her arms around Austin's neck and said quietly, "I do." When the noise died down, the chairman came to the microphone and, addressing everyone, said, "Well, since almost the whole village is here, here's the deal. The school needs a headmaster. I'm putting Iris up for a vote. All those in favor, please put your hands up." Almost all palms were immediately thrown up, and the chairman said, turning to Iris, "Well, unanimous. So we are waiting for you, Iris, at your new place of work. I know you love kids and your education allows you to." Anthony, the fisherman who was now in charge of the estate, came up to Austin and whispered mysteriously, "Why don't you take me as a witness at the wedding? You see, I know for a fact that Iris will offer the role of witness to Lauren, the shop assistant. I really like her, so I was wondering if she'd pay attention to me at your wedding." Austin smiled and, with a pat on the shoulder, replied, "Sure, mate, no problem. As they say, happiness is meant to be shared. Maybe you can invite us to your wedding later." At that moment, Iris came up to him and whispered softly, "Thank you, darling. You've made me believe that life is just beginning, and you've made me really happy." Cynthia noticed it a long time ago. Sometimes strange and sometimes even inexplicable events happen in the surgery department. A person is brought in, and it seems that he has only 5 minutes to live, maybe even less. Especially if he is seriously injured or the disease is too neglected. Then everything depends not only on the doctor, but also on the favorable coincidence of circumstances. Of course, we cannot say that in such almost hopeless situations, the doctor should rely only on help from above. No, in severe cases, the surgeon relies on his own knowledge and experience, not forgetting that you need to act decisively without wasting time. Such was the case with Johnny, a homeless man admitted to the ward 2 days ago, just as Cynthia was on night duty. "Cynthia, there's something wrong," Megan ran into the resident's room and exclaimed. Cynthia looked at the nurse in surprise. Megan was new to the department, but she had already proved herself to be a good nurse. She was not afraid of heavy patients and had a strong nerve. "What's up?" "Did you see a ghost?" Cynthia asked with a touch of irony. "I wish I had." "There's a homeless man, wounded, penetrating stab wound, came in and collapsed on the floor." Right in the emergency room, Megan blurted out. Cynthia's face changed immediately when she heard that. In a case like this, every second counts. You can't afford to delay. Prep the operating theater. "I'll be right there," she said. "But we're a private clinic. Should we call the police?" The nurse hesitated. "We will, but later. Right now we have to save the victim. We'll do the rest afterwards," Cynthia said rather stiffly. The nurse nodded in agreement and hurried to carry out the doctor's orders. Cynthia, on the other hand, hesitated. A stab wound in a homeless man. Cynthia wondered. The clinic was indeed private, and what would Superintendent Walter have to say about it tomorrow morning? As head of the clinic, they're tight-knit. Paid rooms, overpriced medication. Even though the clinic is private. She's going to get in trouble for that surgery. All right, so now we're just going to leave poor Johnny bleeding in the street. What about the doctor's oath? No. Well, whatever happens. Cynthia decided to take action and began to prepare for the operation. Johnny looked to be in his early 30s. He had no time to give his name or the circumstances of his injuries. After all, he had only managed to get to the clinic and collapsed on the floor. Cynthia realized at once that the injury was serious. According to statistics, the lethal outcome of such abdominal injuries is almost 80%. This meant that the operation was likely to fail. The nurse who was to be her assistant realized this. But Cynthia was certainly not going to give up early. She was determined to fight on, no matter what. The operation was complicated. In Cynthia's memory, there were only two of those. For a long time, she couldn't stop the bleeding, which threatened to kill the patient. As it turned out later, Johnny had a rare blood type, which made the task much more difficult. A couple of times, Cynthia wanted to let go of the clamp and simply burst into tears, admitting to herself that there was nothing she could do. Probably such moments occur in the life of everyone who has ever been on the verge of despair. Sensing the doctor's condition, the operating nurse tried not to lose her composure and clearly fulfill all tasks. At one point, there was even a threat of cardiac arrest in the patient, but Cynthia coped. She was able to normalize vital signs and did the near impossible. By the end of the 4-hour surgery, she was barely on her feet from fatigue and despite her inner tension. "Cynthia, we won." "Are you a real magician?" said the operating room nurse Veronica with a smile. "Oh, come on, you don't say." "That's not me, just lucky," replied Cynthia. "But my grandmother, Mrs. Amanda, a field surgeon, was a magician. She was the one who could get even the most hopeless back on their feet." The rest of the shift flew by. Johnny was surprisingly strong and was clearly going to pull through. After checking his condition, Cynthia nodded with satisfaction. "There you'll live. The main thing is to make sure that the lesson is good for you. Many people don't notice such signs of doom." Naturally, the patient could not respond to the doctor's remark, as he was in a medically induced coma. Cynthia could only hope that Johnny would accept her mental attitude. A new day began and new troubles began. Soon the clinic was filling up again with the medical staff who had come on shift during the day. Here Cynthia was in for a very unpleasant surprise. When the police officers, together with Walter, arrived at the ward, they interviewed the nurse on duty and carefully recorded her statements. They spoke to Megan and Veronica, who, while admiring Cynthia's professionalism, put it all out there. "Cynthia, you've caused us a lot of trouble. Why did you get involved with that homeless guy?" Walter, the superintendent, hissed. "What's wrong, Walter?" "Well, what was I supposed to do in that case?" Cynthia asked him in surprise. He looked at her with undisguised anger. "What's wrong, Cynthia?" "Everything is wrong. That tramp is a wanted man, you know. He's kidnapped the 8-year-old son of a businessman, Mr. Jonathan Henderson. The CCTV footage shows the tramp taking the boy to the park. And after that, Bruce Henderson was never seen again. You get it? This Johnny of yours is a murderer and a criminal who should be tried on the spot. What makes you think he had anything to do with the kidnapping? Maybe it wasn't like that." Cynthia frowned. "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Cynthia. It wasn't like that. And what was it like then? Pray tell. If you'd had children of your own, then you'd know that little boys shouldn't go out with tramps," Walter exclaimed angrily. At the mention of children, Cynthia's face darkened. She really had no children, so it was a blow to the heart, but that was not what upset her. It was that the Henderson family name was familiar to her. Her husband, Kevin, had recently considered himself a business associate of Mr. Jonathan Henderson. Cynthia herself was not acquainted with the businessman, but she had heard very conflicting information about him. It was said that Mr. Jonathan Henderson had made his fortune through his wife, Kimberly, who had left him a substantial inheritance and a successful business. The sound of the door opening brought her out of her troubled musings. Kevin was standing on the threshold. His eyes were glowing with anger. "What have you done, Cynthia? Why did you save that bastard?" he blurted out. "There's no place to test him." Walter gloomed and quietly left the office, leaving Cynthia alone with her husband. "Kevin, why are you talking to me like that? Did I give you any reason to?" Her face contorted with anger. "You've got to be kidding me. What excuse do you need? You saved a criminal, you know. And Jonathan Henderson doesn't forgive that. He'll kill you. He'll grind you to a pulp. Just remember," Kevin said. "Today you're a doctor, tomorrow you could be in jail." "Kevin, are you threatening me?" Cynthia turned pale. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "And who rescued that tramp? Do you think the police didn't notice?" "No, they didn't. A private clinic, a surgeon. Tell me, why did he come to your shift? Why did he choose a private clinic instead of going to the city hospital? Maybe the drifter was counting on something? Or knew something?" Cynthia turned pale. Frankly speaking, she had not expected her husband to talk to her in such a way, which turned into a real interrogation. Could she have done anything differently? Should she have left the man to bleed to death? Even if he was a criminal, how could she know that Johnny was involved in some kind of kidnapping? Although the accusation against him sounds naive to say the least. Just because a boy was seen with a tramp doesn't mean anything. The boy could have just got lost and wandered off. After all, someone hurt Johnny himself, and it's unlikely it was an 8-year-old boy. Especially since, according to Kevin, Bruce walked beside the tramp completely voluntarily. And that's saying something. Cynthia's mood finally soured. Mr. Jonathan was not a man to be trifled with. Neither did the head doctor of the clinic, who was his friend. It didn't take long for Mr. Miles to be summoned, unlike Walter and her husband. He didn't beat around the bush and informed me that Cynthia had been retroactively fired. "But I was just doing my job," she whispered. "And I don't care what you were doing, Cynthia. I don't want any trouble, especially not with Jonathan Henderson. Bruce is his adopted son. His wife's dead. He's become a stepfather to the boy. You see, the tramp's unconscious, but they're going to move him to the prison hospital, and they're looking for the boy. So I had to take action, you know. You'll probably get a criminal record. Jonathan Henderson's going to take it to court. He thinks you were in cahoots with that poor bloke. It's not for nothing that he came to you for help," Mr. Miles said without a trace of embarrassment. Cynthia's eyes brimmed with tears. What does that mean? She could be dismissed from her job just like that. What for? Anyone in her position would have done the same thing. She's a medical professional. Unfortunately, Cynthia couldn't change her boss's mind. How could she? When you're accused and called an accomplice by your own husband, Kevin. Of course, he was clearly overreacting. They'd had a lot of fights before. But it's never gone this far. Was the husband so dependent on this Jonathan Henderson that he could talk like this? It's unthinkable. Just like that, like a magic wand. The effect of a successful operation was replaced by bitter disappointment. Cynthia looked longingly at Johnny, handcuffed to the hospital gurney, and smiled sadly. The tramp was just coming round and helplessly trying to find his savior with his eyes, though it was far from certain that he remembered her face. After all, during the initial examination before the operation, Johnny had been unconscious, delirious the whole time. The dismissal process took a little while. Mr. Miles, eager to please Jonathan Henderson, did everything he could to get Cynthia on the street as soon as possible. Understandably so. The far-sighted head doctor was trying to protect himself from possible repercussions. This way, he could just resign retroactively and be done with it. Cynthia walked out of the clinic and exposed her tear-wet face to the sun. Passers-by passed by and looked in amazement at the young woman with sad gray eyes, who was crying. I didn't feel like going home. After the conversation with Kevin, her soul longed for peace and quiet, but she didn't want to listen to reproaches and accusations. She'd had enough of that. Thank you all for your efforts. Not much to say, for in the middle of the day, silence could only be found in a city park. Cynthia crossed to the opposite side of the street and headed to her desired location. Thanks to the nice weather, the park was crowded. Elderly people, couples strolling around, taking pictures of each other against the backdrop of the surrounding beauty, and people who just wanted to be alone with nature. There was a huge fountain in the middle of the park, which provided everyone with a pleasant freshness. Children cheered and squealed, while adults looked on with a smile, remembering themselves as children. Cynthia's mood lightened a little. She walked over to the hot bakery stand and bought a couple of scones to feed the swans and the squirrels scurrying around. The last time she'd done that was a few years ago when she'd first met Kevin. Back then, in that time of romance and bouquets of flowers, they'd taken many walks, visited cafes and cinemas. But all that was in the past. Kevin was very different now. Now he spent a lot of time at work. And when he came home, he often turned into a silent, sullen man. Kevin used to save money on little things, but now he put money aside for everything he could and couldn't afford. And this despite the fact that Cynthia earned a good salary at the private clinic where she had transferred 3 years ago. During that time, she had never regretted her decision. However, the transfer itself was initiated by her husband, who knew her head doctor personally. How long will you hump in this city surgery? A private surgeon has more money and a higher status, Kevin said. Cynthia was hesitant for a long time. because she had done her internship in the Department of Surgery, and in fact it was her way into life. But on the other hand, she did not want to stand still either. After all, the saying goes, under the lying stone does not flow water. Only now she realized that her husband Kevin thought only about money, and the transfer to a private clinic had been initiated by him for that very reason. Now that his business interests had intersected with his wife's work, Kevin did not hesitate to do everything he could to defame her. Well, couldn't he have stepped in and said a word Cynthia thought of Mr. Jonathan? She didn't know the answer to her question, especially as relations with her husband had been rather strained of late. Perhaps this was due to the frequent visits and interference of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Kimberly, who came whenever she pleased, and most often on days when Cynthia was resting from her night's duty. Yet Mrs. Kimberly had a constant thirst for activity that had nothing to do with hard work or a love of cleanliness. Most likely she just wanted to find some flaw in Cynthia's impeccable reputation to reproach her for it. For instance, Mrs. Kimberly could easily initiate a general cleaning, knowing full well that Cynthia had returned from a heavy shift. She also never missed a family party so that she could turn up and do her bit. Naturally, Cynthia was patient, as many daughters-in-law are in this world. Showing character right away was not something she wanted to do. She valued Kevin and realized that it was unlikely that her mother-in-law would love her as her own daughter. So she had to take everything for granted and put up with the fact that Mrs. Kimberly was gradually making her life a living hell. A separate topic of conversation from the mouth of her mother-in-law was childlessness. At first it was innocent talk with an undercurrent that hinted very vaguely that Cynthia was infertile. Then Mrs. Kimberly had the courage to speak of it directly. "Look, Cynthia, when do you think you'll have children? You're what, 30, 35? Are you going to go to your son's graduation party when you're retired?" Mrs. Kimberly said ironically. Cynthia turned pale. "Well, you know very well it's not up to us. First one course of treatment, then another. And the case, as they say, hasn't moved," she said. Mrs. Kimberly grinned. Well, let's see what's going on there, because my friends are already laughing at me. When are you going to be a grandmother? They are about to marry their grandchildren, and you still can't get pregnant." Cynthia's tears welled up with resentment. What could she say when medicine was powerless in these cases? No, she had once suggested to Kevin that he take a child from the orphanage, but he had flatly refused. "No, Cynthia, it's not for me. I don't like these adoptions. I don't know what kind of heredity they have. Who are their parents? What if they're criminals or worse, alcoholics? It's all in the genes. And what do you want us to be taken care of in our old age by some moron who will wait for my pension?" Cynthia shook her head. "You shouldn't say that. I don't think that's true. Children don't inherit the traits of their biological parents, especially if they are taken from an orphanage right after birth." Kevin looked at her as if she'd said something stupid. "Of course, it's easy for you to judge from the outside. I have a business to run, and I need a proper heir. And who do you suggest I take an alcoholic, a vagrant? How can I give him my business, which I've been developing for so many years?" Kevin was indignant. Cynthia blushed to the roots of her hair. "Honey, did you ever think that your son might grow up to be even more successful than you? Become an asset to the business? Maybe even more successful than you and me combined," she suggested. Kevin pressed his lips together resentfully. The notion that some foster child might be better than he was offended him to the core. No, it wouldn't be like that. All those foster kids would be just as much losers as their parents. The parents will drink, party, spend money, and then go to jail. They'll come back with tuberculosis. No, I don't want that kind of pleasure for nothing. He cut him off. Perhaps if her mother-in-law had not been on her husband's side, Cynthia might have persuaded him to take the baby from the orphanage. But since Mrs. Kimberly was also against it, Cynthia's chances were practically nil. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, took real aesthetic pleasure in hurting Cynthia time after time by talking about the children. She would suddenly begin to speculate aloud about what kind of nursery she would like for her grandchildren, or she would talk about the beautiful pram her friends' grandchildren had, and also that she would like to give her grandchildren to the 10th kindergarten, and not to the 3rd. Cynthia was pulled out of a state of sad reflection by someone's quiet, ingratiating voice. "Auntie, I suppose you like to feed the birds?" Cynthia turned round and saw a girl of about 7 behind her, wearing a dress 2 sizes too big and old, worn-out sandals. "Yeah, do you want to join us? Come on, let's go. We'll feed the birds and then the squirrel." "Do you know how funny they are?" replied Cynthia. The little girl suddenly tensed up and looked round, then looked again at the 2 buns that Cynthia had thoughtfully bought for the birds. Little Elizabeth looked at Cynthia in such a way that she felt uneasy. There was too much longing in the eyes of this girl who stood in the park and looked at the treats with hungry eyes. "Would you like me to buy you a bun?" Cynthia asked slowly and cautiously. The little stranger nodded happily. "Of course. But I'd like to have 2 buns. For my brother, he's staying with his grandmother." "I went to look for something to eat," the girl replied. "My grandmother is sick and my parents are dead. Sometimes I work in the park, though my grandmother swears. But what can I do? Do you want? I can dance or recite a poem." Cynthia's heart ached for the little girl. "Oh, really? Come on, just take it for free. Do you want me to go to the shop and buy your brother whatever you want? I'll get you some juice. What are you going to eat? If not, let's go to a cafe and have a proper meal," she suggested. "What's your name anyway?" "I'm Cynthia. You can just call me Aunt Cynthia." The girl paused, as if gathering her strength and thinking whether to tell this strange woman her name or not. At last the little girl said, "And I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Harris. We live near here, in the old annex. We used to have a big house, but it burned down and the firemen were able to save the outhouse. My grandmother and I live there, and we've recently had a baby brother." Cynthia looked at the little girl in surprise. "A baby brother? You said your parents died. He must be little. What is he, a year old?" Elizabeth smiled and took a bun from Cynthia's hands and took a bite. "No, little brother's almost as old as me. He's 8 years old. His name is Bruce. He's a new arrival, but his grandmother took him in. What's he going to do? Wander the streets on his own? It's nice and cozy in our annex. It's not hot in summer, warm in winter, and the stove burns so hot that I even sleep without a blanket. True, we have to prepare firewood from summer, but we manage," the girl continued. Cynthia found the girl's story strange. She was even more alarmed by the boy's name, Bruce. Wasn't he the same Bruce who had disappeared because of Johnny the Tramp? Cynthia wanted to ask the question directly, but then decided to proceed more cautiously. After all, she was talking to a small child who could be frightened or traumatized by an awkward word. There weren't many street kids in town with the name Bruce. Maybe it's a different kid who has taken up with her granddaughter's grandmother in search of sustenance. "What's your grandmother's name, Elizabeth?" Cynthia asked cautiously. "Mrs. Amanda," the girl answered readily. Cynthia smiled. "Can I speak to your grandmother? Don't be afraid. I won't do anything bad to you. I'll just buy some groceries and bring them home to you. And if necessary, I'll go get some medicine for your grandma. I'm actually a doctor." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. "What did you say? You're a doctor? Wow. Then of course let's go to Grandma's house. See if you can give her some advice or give her the right medicine. She's treating herself. You know, she has these little ulcers on her legs. If you don't treat them, they get bigger. I don't even know what it's called." Cynthia shook her head sadly. "It's probably trophic ulcers. They often haunt the elderly. I understand. If necessary, I'll write the right prescription and prescribe treatment. I'm actually a surgeon, but I think in your grandmother's case it might be possible to do without surgery," Cynthia said. Elizabeth listened carefully, as if she understood every word. Cynthia went to the shop and bought a huge bag of groceries before going to the house. Like any smart, thrifty woman, she took everything she needed to make a proper lunch, dinner, and breakfast. As it turned out, Elizabeth really lived not far from the city park and the place where it smoothly passed into the private sector, where several dozen houses, similar to each other as twin brothers, were cosily settled. However, the annex, in which the grandmother and granddaughter lived, stood out even against the background of all the other buildings because it was very small, and of course old and in need of repair. Cynthia realized this as soon as she approached the gate. The roof had rotted away and was covered with old slate, which was probably also leaking and letting in moisture. The panes of glass were dirty and in places covered with cracks that had been covered with sticky tape for safety. The squeaky door was creaking, and Cynthia thought it might as well not be closed at all, especially in the summertime. There was nothing to steal from the house, and it was unlikely that any burglars would attempt this inconspicuous outbuilding. As soon as she stepped through the door, Cynthia could smell the strong odor of medicine. Like any medical man, she considered them an indispensable part of her life. Letting Elizabeth go, Cynthia followed with the bag of groceries. The little girl took a few timid steps and then said, "Grandma, hello. I brought you a doctor. She is a surgeon. She knows how to treat your illness." For a moment, there was a tense pause in the room. Then someone's tired, elderly voice answered, "Thank you. Is it convenient for her to come to our house? This isn't the right place at all. Oh, it's embarrassing." Cynthia smiled and immediately hastened to diffuse the situation. "Oh, come on, Mrs. Amanda. I'm a doctor. I don't care about your surroundings and the fact that there are no repairs. That's not what I'm interested in. Let me examine you and tell you what can be done and what medication to prescribe. You may even have to take a course of medication," said Cynthia. Mrs. Amanda looked at her guest doubtfully. "Well, I don't know. I've been on my own for a long time. I can't walk to the hospital. We don't have a car either. And there's no one to take care of me but Elizabeth." But Cynthia nodded and looked pityingly at the old woman. Of course, she knew how hard it was for her to be alone with her little granddaughter. Now they had a little homeless child with them. If Mrs. Amanda had a daughter or a son, they would have taken her to the hospital and seen a doctor. And so she could only rely on herself and on the help of her underage granddaughter, who needs to go to school, not wander around the park and beg. "All right, let's get to the examination. Where can I wash my hands?" Cynthia asked businesslike. The old woman hesitated for a moment and then asked Elizabeth to show her the bathroom. On her way to it, Cynthia caught a glimpse of the boy in the next room, who was huddled in a corner, clearly afraid of her presence. This fact was extremely alarming. There was something wrong with this, no matter how she looked at it. Usually street children do not behave like this, because the street promotes the development of courage and inconsideration in them, which gives them the right to beg and ask people for anything they want. This boy seemed quiet and a little scared. And he was also clearly wary of Cynthia, who in his mind was a danger in his own home. Cynthia proceeded to inspect, of course, aware that Mrs. Amanda's legs had probably already developed trophic ulcers. Nevertheless, what she saw shocked her even as an experienced medical surgeon. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Mrs. Amanda was unable to buy expensive medicines. So she used the ones that were absolutely useless in her situation. Not only that, but she was self-medicating, which in itself is very dangerous. "You know, Mrs. Amanda, I'd advise you to go to hospital. I'll prescribe the right medication and ointments, but you may need a blood test along with a whole range of other tests. These will help to determine the true picture of the illness," Cynthia began. Mrs. Amanda looked longingly at her guest. "I'm sorry, but how do you envisage it? Who's going to take me? You'd have to hire a taxi to get to the hospital. And you know what they're charging these days. My pension is small. I've been a cook for almost 30 years. I'm always on my feet, so I earned it. I'd keep working. I can't stand anymore, and I can't find a sedentary job. Let me tell you about the accident that killed my kids. They just bought a second-hand car. They had been saving up for it for several years, and then they took to the motorway and went to a neighboring town for a visit. A drunk driver drove into oncoming traffic. It was a no-win situation. It's a good thing Elizabeth was with me, or I wouldn't be alive right now. I'd have someone to take care of me. Elizabeth and that boy are the only ones left." At the mention of the boy, Cynthia shuddered. Perhaps this was a chance to make inquiries about him, but it must be done as quietly as possible so he wouldn't hear. "Look, Mrs. Amanda, do you know Bruce's surname or how you came to have him in the first place?" Mrs. Amanda looked anxiously at Cynthia. "Look, isn't he the reason you're here? Maybe you're not a doctor at all. If you want Bruce to have him, I'm not giving him to anyone. Johnny brought him to me because he said he needed help. And I've known Johnny a long time. He's a good man. He wouldn't do anything bad to us. He told me the boy needed help. So he did." I remember Johnny when he was a teenager. He used to come into my canteen for a snack. He was like a son. But then he got mixed up with a bad crowd, went to jail, did some time, but then he got his head on straight. Except Johnny's stepdad drank up Johnny's flat. That's how he ended up on the street. At the mention of the boy, Cynthia turned pale. At that moment, she realized that Johnny didn't really mean to hurt anyone, but had other aims. Immediately, a rather slender picture began to form in her mind of what might have really happened. For some reason, guessing that little Bruce needed help, Johnny had decided to hide him at his acquaintance's house, and then he was the victim of a robbery that nearly cost him his life. Mrs. Amanda, don't even think about it. I don't want to take anyone away from you. It's just that I operated on Johnny tonight. He's been stabbed in the stomach, you know, and they're accusing him of kidnapping Bruce. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk to the boy and find out what happened, Cynthia said, hardly able to contain her excitement. Mrs. Amanda turned pale. Of course, dear, talk. My God, what's happened to my neighbor? He was like a son to me. Who'd lay a hand on him? He's so kind by nature he wouldn't hurt a fly. And then he gets a knife in the stomach. Cynthia, seeing the worry in the old woman's eyes, hastened to reassure her. No, don't worry, he'll live. I'm sure the operation was a success, although it was hard around 4 in the morning. I came straight from the night shift to see you today. I was sacked for that case, but don't worry, I'll write your prescriptions without all that red tape. You know what I mean? You are treated not with the medicines you have at home now, but with the ones you need in your case. You're making things worse for yourself. And if this keeps going on, it could come to, I don't even want to talk about it. I mean, amputation, you know? Mrs. Amanda had tears in her eyes. Unfortunately, like many elderly people, she was afraid to go to the doctor and decided to treat herself. Leaving her grandmother with her grandson for a while, Cynthia left the room and approached a frightened Bruce. My name is Cynthia. And you're Bruce, aren't you? The boy nodded timidly and looked at her with the look of a hunted wolf cub. Realizing that he was unlikely to say anything, Cynthia continued the conversation. Bruce, I'm sorry to ask you this directly, but Uncle Johnny, who helped you, didn't kidnap you, did he? At the mention of Johnny, Bruce's eyes flashed with joy. No, not at all. Of course he didn't kidnap me. He and I were just hanging out, and Uncle Johnny was always helping. Once he brought a squirrel to my house and showed it through the window, and carved toys out of wood, and little things like that. Anyway, he kept me entertained. Cynthia raised an eyebrow in surprise. Entertained you? Why couldn't you go and entertain yourself? And why did he keep pointing out the window? Bruce gloomed. Well, how can I tell you? My stepfather wouldn't let me go outside. I stayed home all day long. All I could do was open the window a little bit to get some fresh air and see what was going on outside. That's when I met Uncle Johnny. He often went about his business and I waved at him. One wave at first, and then we started greeting each other. And one day I managed to open the window more than usual, and I talked to him. The boy's rambling story brought tears to Cynthia's eyes. She had expected to hear anything but this. The boy had been held hostage by his stepfather, who kept him locked up like a golden cage. Bruce, why didn't your stepfather let you go outside? Were you misbehaving? Cynthia asked cautiously. The boy shook his head resolutely. No, I was behaving well. I even went to school. And then my stepfather suddenly decided that I shouldn't be shown to people, locked me up at home, and arranged with the school principal for me to study remotely. When I didn't do well, I had a tutor come to me. Actually, Uncle Jonathan is not my real father, he's my stepfather. You see, his aunt comes to him all the time. She doesn't like me and locks me in a room when they meet, drinks wine, watches TV, and I have to sit quiet as a mouse and not make any noise. At that moment, Cynthia felt uneasy. Just the thought of Bruce having fun with some girl and his adopted son sitting around waiting for it to be over made Cynthia uncomfortable. She thought for a moment, then asked, Bruce, can you tell anyone else about this if you need to? You know, like the police or the courts? The boy looked at her eagerly. Of course I can. I'd just like to see Uncle Johnny because we came here and then he disappeared. Cynthia frowned, not knowing whether to tell the truth or not, but then, weighing up the pros and cons, she told him what had really happened. A tear immediately rolled down Bruce's cheek. Will he live? Aunt Cynthia? Uncle Johnny, he's a good man, he can't die. She smiled. Of course, I promise. There are different cases, of course, but of this I am 100% sure. Your Uncle Johnny is a real fighter. He's got a grip on life like no other. So you can be proud of him, and I can be proud of you. But now I guess I'd better get going. I have to go to the pharmacy and get some medicine for your grandmother, and then I'll be back. You stay here, don't go anywhere. You've got enough groceries for now. I'm going to try and deal with your stepfather. At the mention of him, Bruce suddenly turned pale and looked anxiously at his guest. Maybe you shouldn't. Or at least be careful, okay? What's wrong with him? Cynthia asked in surprise. Bruce hesitated for a moment, but then said, He's not a good man. When my mom got sick, Uncle Jonathan wouldn't let her go to the doctor, brought him home. In fact, I don't think he was a doctor, he was a gangster. He had blue tattoos on his arms. You know, you don't, but he did. Cynthia tried to keep her cool. She nodded demurely. To tell the truth, she wanted to make a scene with Mr. Jonathan, who pretended to be a prominent businessman, but was in fact a common criminal. And her husband Kevin was a good man, too, finding himself such a companion. I can't tell you. Warning Mrs. Amanda that she was going to the pharmacy, Cynthia left the house and breathed in the fresh air. After the stuffy atmosphere of the dark outbuilding, the street seemed to her a paradisiacal place. Entering the pharmacy, she recalled from memory the list of medicines she needed for her treatment. It should be said that all the drugs from this group were freely available. That is, did not require a prescription. But for some reason the pharmacist refused to give her the medicine. They are freely available, Cynthia objected. I'm a doctor, so I'm the one who made the prescription. If you doubt me, I work at a private clinic called Avicenna. Well, I should say I used to work at Avicenna, she mumbled embarrassedly, thinking, and then decided to call the pharmacy manager. For a moment, Cynthia felt that a scandal was unlikely to be avoided. The superintendent turned out to be a woman in her 40s. Her fingers were covered with rings, and around her neck she wore a braided chain with a massive heart-shaped pendant. Is there a problem? The superintendent asked. Cynthia was convinced that this was going to be a confrontational conversation. Yes, I want to buy these medicines, and they won't let me have them, she said. The manager frowned. They won't release them, you say? You should know that you need a prescription to buy such drugs. So the employee is absolutely right. And if you don't have a prescription, you can go to another pharmacy. Cynthia's lips trembled. Look, you must have misunderstood something. I am a doctor and I know what medicines are on the market. Mrs. Amanda needs them for her tropical ulcers from an allergic reaction. And you're stalling and stalling instead of giving us a chance to cure this woman, Cynthia said with annoyance. My name is Cynthia, and I'm a doctor, a surgeon at the Avicenna private clinic. You may have heard of it? Emily shook her head doubtfully. Then she thought about it, picked up the phone and decided to call Mr. Miles, the doctor. Cynthia waited nervously. In the meantime, the superintendent was already talking to the chief physician, and as her face changed, Cynthia realized that she was likely to be denied her medication. Unfortunately, her premonition had not deceived her. Finished speaking, Emily forcefully put down the receiver of the machine. Then she walked over to Cynthia and said, with emphasized contempt, Look, you're an ex-doctor, so I don't need to be the one who's trying to push my way in here. If you don't like it, nobody's keeping you here, and if you resent it, I'll call security. You're just pretending to be a doctor. She's a doctor. How come you got fired? And what's more, you're facing a criminal offense, and you want to drag me down with you? No, sweetheart, you go back to where you came from. You'll get no help from me. Cynthia's eyes welled up with tears from the offense. What's that supposed to mean? She can't buy medicine anymore. She slammed the door in her face and went to the next pharmacy, which was a few hundred meters away. There she was sold the medicine without any problems. However, her mood was already hopelessly ruined. She wanted to do the best to help an elderly person, but it turned out quite the opposite. On the way back, the telephone in her purse rang. Cynthia wondered who it could be. She picked up the receiver and heard the familiar voice of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Kimberly. "Hello, Cynthia. Where have you been? I've been waiting for you from work for an hour. I bought some cleaning products. I thought I'd clean the windows today and maybe the floors. Your place is such a mess, and you're nowhere to be found. I called Kevin. He doesn't know anything. You've been a little too free lately. You're not out there, are you? 'Cause I've seen a lot of you doctors in my time. I know what you do on your night shifts." And that was the last straw for Cynthia. "What night watch? What are you getting at, Mrs. Kimberly? Don't you know what happened today?" She was outraged. "I operated on a patient at 4 a.m. who came into the clinic with a stab wound to the abdomen. And you're accusing me of infidelity?" "Yes, if you have any doubts, you can inquire at the registrar's office, or even call the head doctor himself. He'll tell you what really happened." Mrs. Kimberly realized she'd overstepped her bounds. However, her mother-in-law was never very good at apologizing, so she decided that the best defense was attack. "Don't raise your voice at me. I'm not your maid. If I said I'm coming today, then be ready and wait for me. Like I have to clean your windows, your fridge is a mess. Don't you have time to cook something? Kevin's going to get an ulcer from an empty stomach." Cynthia just burst into flames. "No, Mrs. Kimberly, your Kevin won't get an ulcer," she said. "He only eats at restaurants. He doesn't eat much at home. He comes home at midnight. I've cooked for him a few times, but nobody eats but me. You know, it's not very nice to work all night and then sit alone waiting for your husband to come home." But Mrs. Kimberly couldn't be persuaded. As mothers-in-law often do, it's always the son-in-law who's closest. And no matter what the daughter-in-law did, it was useless. It felt like she was about to explode with anger. Cynthia interrupted the call and put the phone away in her purse. Once again, her mother-in-law had done everything she could to humiliate her, once again to assert herself at someone else's expense. Of course, Cynthia didn't know that Mrs. Kimberly was actually jealous of her. After all, her sister-in-law had been to medical school. Mrs. Kimberly had a technical degree and a job as a seamstress in a factory. However, she worked there for a short time and left the place when the country was gripped by the thirst for commerce and business. She divorced when Kevin was 2 years old, and the reason for the divorce was that the father of her child was paid too little. Mrs. Kimberly, on the other hand, would only settle for $1 million she had never seen in her life. Is it any wonder that Kevin grew up to be so greedy and unscrupulous about running a business? After all, we can only guess what his mother had to go through in order to accumulate the initial capital, which the son then led in the development of his own business. Back at Mrs. Amanda's, Cynthia set about dressing and treating the wounds on the sick woman's legs. Of course, a nurse on the ward would do this, but as Cynthia was now alone, she had no other choice. "Cynthia, thank you so much. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't know what to do. I can see it's bad, but I haven't told Elizabeth about it so as not to frighten her. I don't want the girl to cry and be afraid I'll be gone," grandmother said with feeling. Cynthia smiled and replied quietly, "Don't worry, Mrs. Amanda, everything will be all right. The medicine will kick in now and you'll feel better. But it's too soon. Remember my words, you will dance at your granddaughter's wedding," she said. After treating the wounds on her legs, Cynthia went to Bruce's room to have another heart-to-heart talk with him. Approaching the boy, she asked, "Bruce, you do realize that if we have to contest the guardianship, Uncle Jonathan will have to give the necessary testimony, don't you?" He looked at her sadly. "Yes, I understand. But tell me, would that really help? Because I don't want to go home. My stepfather will lock me in the basement for what happened. Or worse, he'll call a guard. Uncle Johnny helped me that time. He broke the bars so I could climb out the window. And then we went for a walk together. We went to the park. It was Uncle Johnny who brought me here and said he'd be back soon." At this point, Cynthia suddenly realized that perhaps Johnny could have been hurt by Mr. Jonathan's helpers. After all, if he was connected with crime, what would it take for him to set people up to give the tramp a good beating? Deciding to consult her husband first, Cynthia called to ask how the investigation into Johnny was going. Kevin didn't answer right away. There was a clear irritation in his voice, which was due to the fact that he clearly did not want to talk to Cynthia. "Look, what do you want? You're worried about your tramp. He's alive and well in the prison hospital. He'll get a little sneeze, and then he'll be ready for questioning. I'm sure he'll crack," Kevin said. "It wasn't his fault. I know that for a fact," Cynthia said carefully. Her husband chuckled. "You know, I wonder how you know all this. Are you in bed with him? Maybe he whispered something to you the night you operated on him." Cynthia wrinkled her nose. "No, he didn't whisper anything to me. It's just that you think there's something wrong with the boy. Well, he's fine. And I can say that with confidence to anyone, anywhere." Kevin's voice suddenly sounded suspicious. "Listen, do you know where that boy is? Well, you tell Mr. Jonathan, and he might put you back in the clinic for it. You know he's on good terms with the head doctor. One word from him, and you'll be back in the state. Just tell me, where's that little ragamuffin hiding?" "No, Kevin. I don't think we're going to have this conversation. I'm going to go to the police. And I'd advise your Jonathan to get a good lawyer," Cynthia said. The husband was about to launch into an angry tirade, but he saw that the screen of the smartphone had faded, indicating that she had disconnected the call. "My wife has never done this before. Look how brave she's become. I'll have to tell my mother to rein her in. Look at her. She's completely out of control. She has forgotten who put her in that private clinic for a lot of money," the businessman muttered. Few people knew that in fact Kevin had long been dependent on Mr. Jonathan, who helped him in his business by providing him with some investments to keep him afloat. In return, Kevin had to run all sorts of unpleasant errands. One of these errands was an attempt on the vagrant Johnny, who unwittingly contributed to the escape of his stepson from Jonathan's house. Naturally, Kevin himself did not take part in the attack. He hired people, recently released from prison, to teach the vagrant a lesson. They agreed to do it for a fairly small amount of money. After all, at that time they were in dire need of money. Unfortunately, during the conversation they overreacted, and it came to violence. That's when one of them stabbed Johnny. I guess the conversation didn't work out. Naturally, after the incident, Mr. Jonathan had a big row with Kevin, calling him a fool who couldn't be trusted with anything. Mr. Jonathan was also afraid that Johnny might remember Kevin's helpers and lead the police to them. But Mr. Jonathan controlled his stepson for good reason. He was the main beneficiary of his mother's inheritance. Jonathan had already been a trustee by all the papers, who could not fully dispose of his stepson's money, therefore, and tried to keep the boy in a golden cage, controlling his every move. Of course, Bruce was not a serious danger to Jonathan now, but children grow up fast. What would happen in 5 or 10 years? By then, Jonathan would have raised a dutiful stepson who would give him all his savings when he came of age. And if Bruce grew up to be willful, it would be a complete failure for Jonathan. After talking to her husband, Cynthia was convinced that he was no help, so she decided to spend the night in Mrs. Amanda's outbuilding. And the next morning go to the police. Not alone, but with Bruce, who was to give the necessary evidence while she waited for the morning. The night dragged on like rubber, bringing the inexorable hour of reckoning for Mr. Jonathan and company. What was the surprise of the police when they saw the boy they had been looking for the second day on the doorstep? Bruce smiled sweetly and talked about how he had never been kidnapped. And Uncle Johnny actually helped him. "Look, maybe he's lying about all this," the duty officer asked Cynthia. Cynthia smiled enigmatically. "I don't know. Can you ask him yourself? I think Bruce is telling the truth." "Yes, he is. Uncle Johnny helped me, but my stepfather, Uncle Jonathan, he's really bad. He wouldn't let me go out. So I don't want to go back to him anymore," Bruce said. "He also hurt me and probably seems to have poisoned my mum," Bruce stated. The desk clerk shook his head and then called for the head of operations. This is where Cynthia realized she had done the right thing by contacting law enforcement. Soon a special officer was called for the boy, who was able to find a common language with children. And thanks to this, he quite quickly found out from Bruce everything that the investigation needed. On the same day, Mr. Jonathan was arrested. However, the law enforcers did not manage to keep him in custody for long. After all, on the same day the lawyer made a solid bail for him, but this personally Cynthia did not care. After all, she had achieved the most important thing. Now Bruce will no longer live with his stepfather, who faces trial in real term. Having learned about what his wife Cynthia had done, Kevin was really furious. What does she think she's doing? Does she really want to put me in a nunnery? Jonathan would eat me alive for these tricks, he complained to his mother, Mrs. Kimberly. Mrs. Kimberly thought for a moment. Well, if that's the case, son, I think we ought to be on the safe side. You know you should file for divorce before it's too late. If Jonathan gives you a hard time, you tell him I haven't had a relationship with my wife in a long time. She's not in her right mind, said Mrs. Amanda indignantly. Cynthia hasn't recovered from her dismissal. She does as she pleases. Kevin's eyes twinkled with a sly twinkle. His mother's suggestion certainly appealed to him. And that same day he filed for divorce from Cynthia. Thanks to the testimony of Cynthia and little Bruce, Johnny was cleared of all charges that same day. And homeless Johnny was also transferred to a normal hospital, where he received good care and therapeutic therapy. After Mr. Jonathan's case, the investigation led to the head doctor, Mr. Miles, and the head of the department at the Avicenna Clinic. The couple were now facing criminal penalties that would put an end to their careers as they tried to cover their tracks. Mr. Miles called Cynthia and urged her to come back to work. Except she didn't want to. Instead, she returned to the very city hospital where her career began. There she was able to nurse Johnny, chatting with him about everything in the world. Also, without too much trouble, she was able to arrange with the superintendent for Mrs. Amanda to be placed in one of the wards for intensive therapy. Luckily, this had paid off and her grandmother was slowly on the mend. Cynthia, on the other hand, had a divorce ahead of her, which was arranged by her husband Kevin. The thing was that Kevin decided to leave Cynthia without a house, which was purchased with their joint money. Not only that, in fact, she gave a large sum of money from her own pocket to pay off the mortgage, but Kevin had tactfully kept quiet about it. What was the businessman's surprise when in court he saw next to Cynthia little Bruce and Johnny, who had been discharged from the hospital and was now going to stand up to the end for his saviors. Even a good family law attorney didn't help Kevin that day. In fact, when the boy Bruce told of how and what Cynthia had helped him with, everyone present could not hold back the tears. It was only now that the true extent of Mr. Jonathan and Kevin's scam became clear. Without knowing it himself, the husband had awakened forces that affected not only the boss, but himself as well. Soon all of his associates who had attempted to murder Johnny were apprehended under the pressure of irrefutable evidence. They testified, and Kevin went straight from the courtroom in the divorce case to the detention center. Cynthia, on the other hand, left the court as a winner. Johnny was on her left hand and Bruce on her right. They were met outside by Mrs. Amanda and little Elizabeth, who was holding a bunch of wild flowers. Cynthia smiled and caught herself thinking that it had been a long time since she had felt as good as she did now. That afternoon they had taken many walks and enjoyed what each other had. They had also talked with Johnny about what day they would choose to have their wedding. In the end, they agreed that they would have the wedding on Bruce's mother's birthday, thus giving the baby a kind of gift. After a noisy celebration, Cynthia and Johnny adopted both Bruce and Elizabeth as guardians. The whole family, along with grandmother Mrs. Amanda, moved into Bruce's mother's house. Johnny took a driving course and got his license and became a taxi driver. Bruce and Elizabeth go to school together. Emily counted the money left over from her recent paycheck and sighed dejectedly. It wasn't much, but how could she have more money as a children's librarian, raising her son alone? Maybe it wouldn't be so critical if it weren't for the treatment. Emily had a history of heart problems. Doctors have said more than once that surgery would have made a huge difference and she would be almost completely healthy. But every situation has a but, and in Emily's case, it's understandable. Money, quotas for surgery can wait as long as you want, because there are people with much more serious problems, but to do for money, and her salary was enough only for medicines, and even then not the most expensive analogs. This month she again had to buy a pack of pills, without which she could not even go to work. She wouldn't have the strength, and no one will tolerate her sick leave either. The pills are expensive, and without them you can't go anywhere. It's impossible to save up for the operation. Those pennies that she managed to save before the paycheck yet melted uncontrollably. After all, among other things, it was necessary to support herself and the child. and Emily was completely alone. There was not only no husband, but also no parents. She'd grown up in an orphanage. She didn't know how to complain or beg. But people around her could see how hard their lives were. The library staff, sometimes not understanding, shrugged their shoulders, looking at how Emily walks in the cold in a light jacket, how in the spring walks with wet feet and shoes that are long overdue for the trash. We saw that he goes to work for the 3rd year in the same suit. But what can be done? Because of her illness, she could not even get a job elsewhere. She tried to take part-time jobs when there was no cleaner. She got a part-time job and only lasted a month. She didn't have the strength to fumble with buckets, climbing the shelves, wiping the dust. I had to give it up. And yet there was some extra pay. I don't understand. Since you have a child, so some man was there after all. Can't you file for alimony? Well, at least you'd get a penny, the head of the library once told her. Yes, there really was a man. And not just any man, but a beloved one. But what is now left of this love? Only a memory. Matthew. Emily, of course, was grateful to Jack for her son, as well as for her love, for the happiness that lasted so short. But there was no one to blame. What had she hoped for? An orphanage fool. A student at a library school, when she got together with a guy from a rich family. It's very rare for such relationships to last and lead to a happy marriage. Now she was facing betrayal. No, Emily didn't want to think of her lover that way. At first, Emily thought it happened when Jack's father met her on the street and said, "Don't mess with my son's head or interfere with his happiness. Jack has a great future. Understand, he has a fiancée, a beautiful girl with whom they will be happy. He keeps seeing you out of pity. He got infatuated at one point, and now he doesn't know how to leave you. He told me and my mother that himself, he almost cried. He doesn't need you. And he doesn't dare to give up. He says you're putting so much pressure on him that you're almost threatening to kill yourself. But I'm sure you're a sensible girl and will do the right thing." "Yes, of course," Emily whispered with frozen lips. But still she had some hope left. And yet he himself said he loved me, that we would marry. But I explained to you out of pity, and purely out of pity. You are an orphan. You'll be working in the library, and he's got a business to start. Well, think what kind of a bride you are to him. Every cricket knows its place, remember? So here's what I propose. I've taken a trip to a very nice vacation home. It's in the suburbs. You're just about to start your vacation. The nature there is wonderful. You're bound to meet someone. Well, someone much more suitable for you. And don't say anything to Jack. Just go away. When you come back, all will be forgotten. Thanks. I don't need it. The girl backed away from the voucher held out to her. But her lover's father insisted. No, you don't understand. If you don't go, you'll be dating again, whining, crying, and threatening. As a result, Jack will have no choice but to continue this relationship that is wearing him down. If you have any feelings for him, take the trip and go. It's fine if you don't care about Jack. At least think about yourself. You're being offered a great way out, but if you don't take it, believe me, I'll find other ways, and they'll be a lot less pleasant." Emily took the trip, not because she was afraid, but because she thought that maybe the older man wasn't lying. Indeed, it would be better for his son if Emily wasn't there. Maybe he really doesn't know how to break up with her anymore. But what if she could help him do that? And Emily went to this suburban vacation home, where, of course, did not meet anyone and just lay in her room with her face in the pillow. Even without looking at the beauty of the surrounding nature, sometimes I wanted to jump up, to run into town on foot and rush to Jack. Tell him she loved him. Explain that they were having a baby. Yes, it was already there at the vacation home, and that could really change the whole thing. No matter how Jack felt about her, a baby was a big deal. And they can't just go their separate ways. But doesn't that seem like a real imposition? So back in Chicago, Emily went to the doctor. Not for referral to a known surgery, but just to check in after a checkup. The doctor shook his head. "Do you know you have heart problems? I wouldn't recommend you have children." It was only then that Emily learned of these very problems, having always thought she was perfectly healthy. She thought the doctor was trying to discourage her, knowing that she was unmarried. But she refused, saying she still wanted to have the baby because she loved him, and she didn't need it to try to get Jack back. She'd given up on the idea. She'd been gone for 3 weeks. She'd left without warning, without saying goodbye, and her lover must have been surprised at first, and then sighed with relief. After all, you cannot force a man to love someone who he does not need, who interferes. Now, even if he married her, It would really be only out of pity and no other way. And this Emily did not want at all. She understood perfectly well how difficult it would be for her alone with a child. But after all, she wasn't the first and she wouldn't be the last. Even girls she knew from the orphanage sometimes found themselves in such situations, and some of them gave birth to children without a husband, nothing they lived. The main thing is that there will be a child and he will be loved, and the most expensive, and so it was. Matthew was born, and Emily joined the army of single mothers and heart patients who need constant treatment and surgery, for which there is no money. She tried to get treatment because she realized that if she died, Matthew would be left all alone and an orphanage would be waiting for him, and she couldn't let that happen. And she decided that, whatever it was, she should live at least until his 18th birthday, and when he became an adult, it would be easier for him to cope with life's difficulties. Emily tried to raise her boy to be an independent man. She did not think about asking Jack for any material support. First, she had no idea where he lived now. He must have left his parents' home after getting married. But even if he had, Emily couldn't imagine that situation. Here she would come to him and start reminding him of herself, telling him that they had a child together, that she was having a hard time, needed treatment, needed money, and needed something else. No, she had never asked anyone for anything and never would. And now, if she was in any way dear to him, he would have found her long ago, if only to explain himself. And since he didn't, she would have to bear that cross on her own, and she would raise a son who would never know his father. But it wouldn't interfere with his life. If his father didn't want him, there was no need to impose on him. Matthew became her only joy, her dearest boy, for whom she spared nothing. Only she had nothing. Every time she bought her own medicine, she was very upset, feeling that she was taking money away from her child, depriving him of what other children had. He was now only 6 years old. Next year, he would be going to school, and there the inequality would be felt much more acutely. For now, he didn't demand anything. He wasn't upset that his toys or clothes weren't the same as others. She was very worried about what would happen then. She realized that the only way out was to earn more, but she couldn't do that because of her health problems. It was a vicious circle from which she saw no way out, and Matthew really grew up to be an independent boy. He helped his mom as much as he could without giving her much trouble. Knowing that she needed more rest, he was already walking alone. So Matthew knew exactly what time to come home so that his mother wouldn't worry. At first he walked on the playground outside the house, so that Emily could see him at any time from the window. But after he turned 6 years old, someone in the neighborhood in the private sector arranged a great playground in the yard with a big sandbox, a slide and other children's entertainment, and Matthew started asking his mom to let him go for a walk there. "Matthew, what about it? It's not like I won't see you out the window, I'll worry. It's not good for me," Emily was saying. "Mom, that's exactly where you don't have to worry. There's a guard there, and they won't let anyone bad on the playground, and it's not far away. You don't have to cross the road," replied the son. "But you see, there's a guard and he can kick you out. To say that this playground is only for those who live in that big house," Emily tried to dissuade her son. But he persisted. "They don't kick anyone out there. I've already been there. It's not like it's written on me where I live." Poor kid. He didn't realize that it wasn't written on him, of course, but you could tell from his clothes that he couldn't live in that rich house where people lived who took much better care of their children's clothes. Matthew might not be kicked out, though you never know. Anything could happen. But why should the child have to suffer unnecessary distress? But to forbid him to do so was also to upset him. So Emily decided that sometimes Matthew could go for a walk there, while she went shopping at the nearest supermarket, for example. When she saw how her son liked to play on the playground, that he had some friends there and no one chased him away, she realized that he really knew the way home, and decided to let him go for a walk to the playground alone. During another such walk, a strange incident happened. One day a non-local boy wandered into the playground, older than the kids, most of whom parents let walk alone, hoping for a protected neighborhood. And so this older boy started hurting another 6-year-old, trying to take something away from him. The little major didn't know how to fight, just waved him off and cried. And Matthew decided to stand up for him. He did a pretty good job of it. But it wasn't a serious fight, of course. The boys weren't big enough to hurt each other, However, the intercession made an impression on the child of rich parents. "Nice job chasing him off," he said to Matthew, wiping his nose. "Have you always been so brave, or is it something you have to learn?" "Seems like I always have been. But my mom also tells me to stick up for the weak. You need to be stronger." "How old are you?" 6. Then what if I child 9? "Well, so am I. 6. It's quite possible not to be afraid of any bullies. My name is Matthew. What's yours?" "I'm Kevin. My dad told me that later I'm going to go to some kind of club where they teach me to fight and stand up for myself. But I guess they teach me to stand up for others, too. But that's later, when I go to school." "What house do you live in?" That's how the boys became friends. Matthew began to go to the playground not just to play, but to his friend Kevin. At first, it was just a friendship between boys who were starting to feel big. They played together, sometimes talking about their own stuff. In short, nothing special. But one day, Kevin went out with an expensive cell phone. And he went out with it not to show it off, but to please his friend. "Here, Matthew, I decided to give you this," he said, holding it out to his friend, "because you don't have any. I mean, it's very convenient. We'll call each other. My number is entered here. Here you go." "Thank you. But it's very expensive." "My mom said they'll buy it for sure. But when I go to school, maybe I shouldn't. Will your parents fight?" "No. My dad bought himself a new one, and this one's just lying around. He always does that. He buys himself a new model and gives me the old one. And I still have a good old phone. Look, let me teach you how to play on it." "No, don't. Your dad will swear. It's a really expensive thing." Matthew was already aware of the fact that things had prices. Kevin was the one who was used to having a lot of things and didn't think about any money. But this time he disagreed with his friend. "Take it from you. My dad's kind. He's the one who never swears, it's Mom." "But she's not real," Kevin said. "What do you mean she's not real?" Matthew wondered. "Well, it's like this. Does your mom love you? Of course, all moms love kids. It's the real ones who love. Yours is real then. But mine doesn't love me, doesn't talk to me, just shouts, 'Go away, and don't touch me.' I'm sick of her." Matthew was in a gimme of such a relationship with his mom. He did take the smartphone, but not so much out of greed or desire to possess such a toy. He just felt sorry for Kevin. He wouldn't trade his mom for any smartphone. He might not have expensive things, but he had a real mom. Emily, on the other hand, was horrified when she saw her son's expensive phone. She didn't think that Matthew had stooped to stealing, but his son was still young and didn't understand the value of such things. Maybe he'd just taken someone else's lost? "No, Mom, a friend gave it to me. He is good. His dad doesn't need this phone, so he gave it to Kevin, and he has one, so he gave it to him." "But your Kevin didn't earn the money for that phone on his own. His dad might get mad. You better give it back. We don't want any more trouble." "There won't be any trouble. He gave it to me as a gift. I didn't want to take it myself, but Kevin took offense. I had to take it. But please let me keep it for at least a little while. Or can I play with it and then give it back?" Then Emily waved her hand. Her son's eyes shone with happiness at having such an expensive, interesting object. She really couldn't buy him something like that anytime soon. And she had enough of her own things to deal with some other people's things that one child had given to another. They couldn't run off and find Kevin right now. And the other day, Matthew would actually give it to her to play. But things didn't turn out quite the way Emily and Matthew thought they would. The phone belonged to Jack Pavlovic, a prominent businessman. The company he ran had been inherited from his father, who had died a few years ago, and he had successfully continued his business. Jack really spared nothing for his son, even though Kevin was not his own child, but an adopted one. It so happened that a successful man in business was unhappy in his personal life. He got married 5 years ago without much love. The first very unsuccessful affair had hurt him, and he was sure that love does not exist, and in general from a woman to expect good things do not have to wait. His favorite girl, whom he was going to marry, just ran away to some unknown place without even saying goodbye. But she had sworn her love. His father opened his eyes then, said that he had learned something about this beloved, and she is clearly not who she pretended to be. She had escaped not on her own, but with a new fiancé or lover, going somewhere in the South. For a long time after that, Jack did not look at women. And when she appeared in his life, he did not hesitate long. She did not give such an opportunity, literally stuck to him, not leaving one for a minute. His father was against this marriage, but he was already seriously ill at the time and could not influence his son. I declared after the first night we spent together that I was pregnant, and there was no arguing against it. Jack married her. The pregnancy turned out to be a hoax. What's more, my wife said she wasn't going to have the baby. Do you have any idea what a torment it is? Did you really decide to put me through such an ordeal? She said. I'm not talking about the fact that after childbirth a woman's figure, face and everything changes. Emily, we got married because you were going to have a baby. And now you're saying you didn't have a baby then, and you won't have a baby after. What's the point of our family then? What should we divorce now? Jack replied. And here's another thing. Divorce is if we don't love each other. And if you want a child, we could adopt someone from an orphanage, Emily suggested. Jack agreed to that. He couldn't accept the fact that he wouldn't have children at all. That's how Kevin came into their family. The boy is now almost 3 years old. Jack wanted to take a breastfed baby first, but Emily didn't agree to that either. What newborn, Jack? Imagine he'll be screaming all day and night, won't let you sleep, won't eat anything. All you'll be doing is cradling it in your arms all day long. Let's take an older child who can walk, talk, and understand something. I'm not going to tolerate a baby in the house, she said. Yeah, that's the kind of wife Jack had. The child was taken, but Emily never became a mother. In the early days, she seemed kind to the boy. At least she tried to pretend to be. But then he started to get in her way, and more often she just pushed the baby away. Ben, sensing this aloofness, wasn't particularly drawn to Emily either. He rarely even called her mom. Jack had almost resigned himself to the fact that his personal life would never be happy. He loved the boy, thought of him as his son. He behaved with him as fathers do with their children, and tried to ignore his wife's antics. Even when he learned that she was probably unfaithful to him, he was not very upset. In fact, he thought that the divorce, a matter solved. He just didn't have time to deal with it. The phone, which was appropriated by his son, he was not superfluous, just used it infrequently, only on special occasions for business-related calls. There came a time when he needed this particular phone. He needed to consult with someone in the know. Jack had noticed that there was something wrong with his company's accounts, sometimes small, but still noticeable amounts of money were missing. The numbers of the right people were written down in that very phone. And he started looking for it and couldn't find it, as there were no strangers in their apartment. He asked his wife. She replied that she hadn't seen it and wasn't hired to wallenge hired people's stuff at all, much less the children of her beautiful son. Ask it as he is forever grabbing everyone, dragging them somewhere. Discussing child absolutely does not understand where is his own and where is someone else's, she said. And he doesn't have anything foreign in our apartment, Jack retorted, who was fed up with his wife's attitude toward his son, albeit an adopted one. After all, they'd taken him in at her request. Now she was hurting the little boy every now and then, but he picked up the phone. Alone. Most likely, so the child. And there's nothing criminal in this, of course, he thought. Jack called his son and asked about the phone. He calmly replied, Yes, Dad, I took it. I thought you didn't need it anymore. You've got another fancy new one. No, Kevin, it doesn't work that way. Whether you need it or not, you should have asked me first before you took someone else's stuff. I hope you didn't break it. Bring it over here. I really need it now, Jack said sternly. Oh, Dad, I don't have it, said the son. What do you mean you don't have it? Where did you put it? I gave it to a friend. Well, since you didn't need it, as I thought. And he doesn't have a cell phone, does he? What friend? How could you take someone else's thing and give it to someone else? Where does he live? Do you know? He showed me where his house is. Only I don't remember the number. I don't remember the apartment either, but he lives on the 3rd floor with his mom. And his name is Matthew. He's really nice, the little boy tried to explain to his father. Oh, Kevin. I doubt he's very nice, but dragging things out of the house to give to a complete stranger isn't very nice. You're 6 years old now. You should understand, but there was nothing to do. The only way out was to call the very same donated phone and explain to the unknowing Matthew that the owner needed it urgently. If it's a normal kid, there won't be any big problems. If he's not, he'll immediately give away the stranger's item. Jack dialed from his regular cell phone, turning on the video link. Emily answered the phone, seeing a face on the screen that he'd never expected to see again. Jack was just as confused. Emily was confused too. The virtual meeting was a complete surprise to both of them, and not a pleasant one. Jack explained the purpose of his call, and Emily nodded understandingly. It's an interesting case. I haven't believed in coincidences for a long time, and it turns out it was your phone that got into my son's hands. Did you set this whole thing up on purpose? She asked. How could I have set it up? Did I give your kid a cell phone? You gave it to your son, and you were perfectly capable of explaining to a 6-year-old why, and who he should give it to. What more do you want from me? Tell me, Jack. It's not enough that you ruined my life once. You want to take it all back. Have some more fun with me. You've got a wife, a kid, but what else do you want? Oh, you're out of your mind. I don't need anything from you, he replied. Thank you. I never had any fun with you. You're the one who did, you have to admit, not well. I'm not good. What do you mean? At least about the fact that decent girls don't run away the day after they've consented to marriage. Anyway, let's not make up any nonsense. You can leave the phone to your son. Since his dad can't buy one, we can do it all, don't worry. We don't need your handouts. Come and get it. Or am I going to throw him out? Holding back tears, Emily blurted out, Yeah, do whatever you want with him. I wish you'd never mentioned yourself at all. At that, the conversation ended. Emily handed the phone to Nadia's son. Just better not date this Kevin guy. Why, Mom? I mean, he's not bad. He's good, really. Who was that on the phone? Oh, I'll tell you later. I need to lie down and rest and take a pill. Emily's chest pinched again. I can't believe Jack and his phone and his son. Matthew says this Kevin is 6 too, which means Jack's father wasn't lying. He got married right after he broke up with her, Emily. Or maybe he was already living with the other girl who became his wife. Or was that meeting an accident? Very possibly. But maybe it wasn't a coincidence at all. Maybe it was just as she'd said in the heat of the moment. Jack had slipped his son a cell phone, told him to give it to that boy. I wondered if he realized Matthew was his child. Jack didn't, of course, but he was plagued by the same thoughts. So Emily has a 6-year-old son. She had gone south then, as his father had said, and it was probably at that very time, and from that man that she had this boy Matthew, with whom his Kevin was now friends. An accident. Perhaps Jack had seen Kevin playing on the playground. Maybe he saw this Matthew. They live in a different house. Not theirs, which means Emily is still living there, in the apartment she was given when she graduated from the orphanage. So what, she found a fiancé who didn't even have a place of her own? Or did this Matthew's father just not marry her? What difference does it make now? It's none of his business. And it's a good thing they'll never see each other again. Her heart was already boiling hot after that conversation. Nothing, it turned out, had been forgotten or ended after Emily's elopement. As luck would have it, the witness to that conversation was Jana, who was sitting in the next room. This alarmed her. She sensed that perhaps the conversation could threaten her well-being. She was well aware that her husband had no special feelings for her, but she had no suspicions about other women either. And thanks to this, she always thought that her position was quite solid. And suddenly, with whom was this scandal only over the phone? Who's the one who ran away from you on the eve of the wedding? And why don't I know anything about it? She pestered with questions. Because it's none of your business, Jack replied sharply. And anyway, don't eavesdrop on other people's conversations. Mind your own business. Call Steve on his cell phone. Yes, Jack was aware of even his rival's name, which came as a complete surprise to Emily. Who else is Steve blabbing something to? She shouted. You don't cheat at every turn and then you accuse me of it. Who did you call? Who did you give that phone to? Just get off my back. Why are you bothering me? I didn't call anyone and I didn't give anyone anything. Jack shoved his wife out of the room without any delicacy and closed the door tightly. This was something new. He had never acted so rudely before. I sensed that things were getting serious, so I decided to act. The first step was to find out who the call had been made to. Emily made a logical chain. The husband was looking for a cell phone that the son had apparently stolen, and not just stolen, but given or given away. So much for bad genes. and then the husband apparently called the boy. He ran into his mother and recognized her as his ex or current lover. Very interesting. It would be good to find out who this mom is. Her relationship with Kevin wasn't great, but this time she decided to still roll up to the boy to get more details from him. "Sonny, come here," she called out to the boy affectionately. He trustingly approached, and she began to pry. "Well, tell Mommy. What did you and Daddy talk about? Did you give his phone number to someone?" "Yeah, I gave it to a friend. I didn't know Daddy would need it." "But he hardly swore," the man replied. "Of course he did. What's wrong with that? Giving friends cell phones, everyone does that. And the boy is nice, you say. What's his name?" "Matthew. Does he come to the playground with his mom?" "No, she picks him up sometimes when she comes from the store, but otherwise he walks alone. We're big, aren't we?" "Of course we are. Has your daddy talked to your mommy? Have you ever seen one?" "No, Daddy didn't talk to her. I think he was on the phone to her. On his phone that he seemed to need," Kevin tried to explain. "That's fine. Do you know where this Matthew guy lives?" Emily rubbed the boy's arm. "I don't. Why would you?" The child clearly didn't like this conversation. He was used to not expecting good things from his mom. "But since I'm asking, it means I need to. And I can see that you're lying to me. Surely you know where he lives. In our building. In which apartment? Well, tell me. You can't lie to your mother," she pestered more and more insistently. "I'm not lying, really, I don't know. It's not as if I've never been to his place. But he doesn't live in our house. He lives in some other house. Show me, it's not far. And since he goes to our playground, it's not far, 2 houses down from ours. You can even see him from the playground. A gray building, 5 stories high. And they live on the 3rd floor. But I don't know anything else." Kevin tried to deny it. "What a silly boy," Olivia said irritably, realizing that Mia couldn't get more out of the child. She'd had enough of that for now, though. She gave Kevin a familiar spanking. "Go on, go to your room, do whatever you want, and leave me alone." Now she knew where the woman her husband had been talking to lived. Knew what floor. Of course, she wasn't going to go around to all the 3rd floor apartments. But asking the locals would accomplish more than that. She had obviously gone to that very house to find out where the right people lived. As it turned out, it really wasn't that hard. From the grandmother sitting on the bench, she found out where a lonely woman and her young son Matthew lived. Without hesitation, she went up to the right floor and rang the doorbell with determination. The door was opened by Emily herself, who was waiting for the doctor who had been summoned after her conversation with Jack. She was glad that help had come so quickly. Her heart ached after that unexpected call, and then suddenly a stranger came in and laid out her grievances from the doorstep. "What are you doing? Such an asshole. Why are you clinging to other people's husbands?" With her hands at her sides, Mia began to scandalize. "What husbands? What are you talking about?" Emily didn't understand. She didn't care at all about arguing and fighting. She was feeling very ill at ease. "To husbands like this. To my Jack. Why did you call him? What did you two agree on there? You remember, Gray Mouse. He doesn't need you at all. So this is my husband-in-law. He's married to me and loves only me. He doesn't even want to know you. Who needs you, you abandoned single mom? We have a son. We've been together a long time. We don't want to know you. I don't want to know anyone, and I don't cling to anyone. Go away, please. He's the one who called. I'm sorry I can't talk to you. I'm not well and I'm waiting for a doctor," Emily said hopefully. "Only you risk not waiting for anyone anymore if you keep acting like this. You're wrong if you think I'm going to give up my husband to you easily," Mia said. "I don't need your husband," Emily replied. And Mia apparently realized that the woman was not pretending. Her face had gone completely pale. Emily could barely stand on her feet. A boy came out of the room and said firmly, "Don't scold my mom. Here's that uncle's phone number. You don't need it. Take it and leave." Mia took the smartphone, looked closely at the boy, and saw a distinct resemblance to her husband. "Fine, cheer on, but don't let me hear another word about you. Not about you or your mommy. And don't come anywhere near me again." Just then, a doctor who knew Olivia and her problems well came to the door. He saw that the woman was not feeling well, and without getting into the essence of her conversation with the strangers, took Emily into the room. Mia, not quite satisfied with the scene, went home. Entering her husband's room, she tossed him the phone. "Here, take it. I talked to your mistress, and she promised that she will not go near you again." "Oh, and she probably can't right now. The ambulance is taking her away and probably already ahead of her feet." "What?" Jack shouted out. "What have you done?" A wild thought occurred to him. Olivia had done something terrible to Emily. Some women are capable of things that would never occur to him. He imagined acid in his face. God, poor Emily. Has something irreparable really happened to her? He jumped out of the apartment and rushed toward the house where his beloved lived, and he didn't have to ask anyone for her address. There was an ambulance outside one of the entrances. The paramedics were carrying Emily, who was unconscious, out on a stretcher. Following them was a crying Matthew, who didn't know what to do now. And he was all alone without his mom. Jack went to get the ambulance, taking the boy with him and comforting him along the way. "Don't cry. Is your name Matthew?" "That's fine. Now we'll ask the doctors what's up with your mom, and then we'll go home." "How am I supposed to be home alone now? We have no one, no relatives." "Will my mom be discharged soon?" Matthew cried. "We'll find out everything now. While Mom's in the hospital, you'll stay at my place with Kevin. I'm his dad. You'll be like brothers. You guys are friends, right?" "Yeah, we are." "I gave your phone to the aunt who yelled my mom," Matthew said. At the hospital, Jack learned about Emily's illness and what he could do to help her. "The situation is serious. We need to do some testing to figure out how to fix it," was all the hospital told him. He and Matthew drove home. When Olivia saw that her husband didn't come alone, she recognized the boy and immediately screamed, "What's that?" "It's not what, it's who. It's Matthew. He's staying with us while Emily is in the hospital. I think she got there after talking to you," replied the husband. "But you decided to round up all the foundlings. Why on earth would he come to us? I don't understand. What are you doing with his mother? Maybe you're having an affair. That doesn't mean anything. Send him to an orphanage, or better yet, both of them. I'm sick of this." Kevin was just coming out of the room. "While my dad was away, I'd snapped at him every now and then, and I'd even given him a painful slap. But when he saw that Daddy had arrived with Matthew, and he was going to live with them, he forgot all about his worries. And Olivia's worries only grew. She wanted to get rid of her rival. But it turned out the other way around. Now that rival's son would be living with them. Why should she, when she'd had enough of one foster child? And her husband, whom she'd love to get rid of. But Jack decided not to get into any arguments with her. He asked Olivia to mind her own business and went to set Matthew up in his son's room. It was clear to him that Olivia was going to have to be divorced, no matter what happened with Emily. He already knew that she had no husband, no one. But did that give him any hope? Jack didn't know. The next day he went alone to the hospital, where he learned from the doctors all the details of Emily's condition and what was necessary for her full recovery. Realizing that he could not remain indifferent to the fate of his beloved, Jack decided to pay for the operation and informed Matthew about it when he arrived home. "Well, friend, looks like you're going to have to stay with us a little longer than expected, but at least your mom will be perfectly healthy when she's discharged, and she won't have to be on medication all the time." The boy was happy, although he missed his mom very much and wanted her to be discharged as soon as possible. I, on the other hand, wanted both foster kids out of her house as soon as possible. "You know, Olivia, you're going to have to get out. I've made the decision to divorce you. There's nothing tying us together. After all, you have some loved one in there, and I don't think our divorce will be a big blow to you." Olivia, on the other hand, thought the opposite. And Emily's surgery had been quite successful, but it took a long time to recover, and Matthew continued to live with Jack. Everything was fine until both boys suddenly felt sick. It wasn't just a cold, but some kind of infection that was dangerous for adults too. Again, the ambulance had to be called, and the doctors, to find out what was wrong with the children and whether they had managed to infect the adults, took tests from all of them. So it turned out there was nothing dangerous. Jack and Olivia were not infected. The boys would recover soon, as the doctor informed the worried father. "I take it one of the boys is not your son?" the doctor asked. "Yes. One of them is the son of an acquaintance. Wait a minute, though. The other one isn't a native either. My son is adopted." "That's odd. According to the tests, you and one of the boys have very similar blood. By the way, he looks like you, too." "I'm talking about Matthew. What's smitten?" Jack asked. Maybe My Son by Emily. But I'm not confirming that. That would require DNA testing. But it looks like it is, smiled the doctor. Jack was dumbfounded. What was it coming out to be? His father had tricked him. Emily hadn't gone off with some lover. She'd just gone somewhere without telling him about the pregnancy before or after. But why? Why was his son living without knowing his father? To be sure of this definitively, he took tests for a DNA test and soon got an unequivocal answer. Matthew was his son. That changed everything. In fact, it changed their lives too. He decided not to tell his wife about his discovery, but she found the results herself and realized she had to act quickly. The only way was to eliminate Emily. The fact that they would have both boys left in their house was not that important after all. All that mattered was that she didn't end up on the street. Her lover couldn't provide for her. She found out where Matthew's mother was hospitalized and went there. Emily was in the intensive care unit, where no one was allowed. But Olivia knew how to negotiate. So I'm not a stranger, I'm her best friend. I'm practically her sister. I just need to see Emily. My son is staying with me. I should tell her he's fine. Then she won't worry and she'll heal a lot faster. But I want to say hello to Matthew for her, too. You have a heart. Please let me in for a moment, Mia begged the doctor on duty. And still she got into the ward. She was left alone with her friend for a minute, and she leaned over the face of sleeping Emily, smiled wickedly, reached out her hand, and turned off the machine that kept the woman alive. Alas, nothing came of it. The signal went straight to the on-duty doctor's console. Emily was rescued and Olivia was handed over to the police. Then Matthew got the call, informing him of what his wife had done. Yeah, she just stepped out of line. I'm sure Mia didn't mean any harm, and hit the machine by accident, he excused her. They let her go. They forbade her to go anywhere near the hospital. And Jack realized that his life was about to take a very different course. All he had to do was wait until Emily was fully recovered and talk to her about what had happened. When Emily recovered a little from the surgery, he went to her house and bought her flowers. Emily was all Jack said as he entered the room. Hello. She was still half lying down, not trying to get up, but she looked noticeably better. I'm so grateful for everything you've done for me and for my boy, our boy. Yes, I know all of it. He placed the flowers on the nightstand, kissed her thin, almost transparent but warm hand. So why didn't you tell me anything? How did you live these years without me? And why didn't I know I was raising such a wonderful, independent son? But you found out anyway, Emily smiled through her tears, and I was sure I would. At first, Emily was deeply hurt. Thought he didn't know. That's just the way he should be. Then she realized how stupid it was. But it was all over now. Okay, I hope you don't want to take him away from me, she said. Well, I do, although he and I have become very good friends. And I'd like him to live with me, and so would you, the man admitted. And as what would I live at your place? A housekeeper? She frowned. Clearly, your spouse doesn't like to trouble herself. How is she, by the way? She's been let go. I was told she wanted to kill me. They let her go, and I let her go. We're getting a divorce. I realize that offering you my hand and heart right now is foolish. I don't think you'll ever forgive me, but maybe I can earn your affection, whether I do or not. I offer you to live near me. I'll buy you an apartment in our building so you and Matthew will always be close by, so I can take care of you, help you. Will you accept? Emily smiled confusedly, then turned her back to the wall to hide the newly protruding tears. Wait a minute, Jack. You're making up your mind pretty fast. I don't have time for this right now, honestly, but I'll definitely think about it. For now, I'm sorry. I'm really tired. Emily hurried to say goodbye to Jack, not because she wasn't feeling well. She wasn't feeling bad. She just needed to think about everything that had happened in her life lately. She'd never stopped loving Jack, living alone, often dreaming of how they'd meet, how he'd realize what he'd lost by abandoning her. But would she forgive him? In her dreams, this meeting always happened in different ways. Sometimes they were together. Sometimes she proudly turned and walked away. But now they meet, and he offers her a life together. He seems to understand and wants to be with her and her son, and that's what she wants. Can't she just say yes? Forgive everything and start a new life? because it's not going to be the same. Matthew has a father. Now they don't have to hide from each other. And if they meet, father and son, there will be questions about why they don't live together. Yes, it's hard for her to just say yes. But why? Because the resentment is long gone, but the love is still there. And she doesn't need anyone but Jack. He had a lot to think about, too. Olivia was over, that's for sure. But what would it take to make it start with Emily? He was already envisioning his new family, almost perfect. Him and his lovely wife, 2 kids. No doubt Kevin would stay with them. Olivia wouldn't even think about fighting for her son, but Emily would. If she agreed to be his wife, she would accept his son, even if he wasn't her own. There was no doubt about that. But would she accept the man who had once betrayed her? It was painful to remember it, but soon personal problems receded into the background, had to solve other, no less complex issues. Realizing that the divorce cannot be avoided, Olivia decided to act. After all, Jack's parents, having learned that their son decided to get married, insisted on the conclusion of the marriage contract which themselves had compiled. The groom at that moment was so carried away by his beloved that he did not pay much attention to it. She too apparently was overconfident. Quite soon after the marriage, Jack himself realized how wise his father had been. But worse than that, Olivia had realized it, and only now, when it turned out that her husband was serious about getting a divorce, and there wasn't much she was entitled to under the terms of the contract. Especially if the divorce was her fault, and it was undeniably her fault. Jack found out about the affair. She'd been caught trying to kill him, and she hadn't given him any children. Yes, there was Kevin, but Olivia wasn't going to keep the baby, not even for child support. She never got to love the boy, and he was a real burden. It was a real burden to be a divorcee with a trailer. No, it wasn't for her, Steve. She wasn't sure she'd be needed by her lover anymore, not as a rich man's wife, but as a single, poor woman. No matter how one looked at it, the child was a burden. Although her selfish mind immediately found a way out, she had only to rejoice in her ability to make the right acquaintances and rub in the trust. She, thanks to this, sometimes arranged from the accounts of her husband's company leakage of funds, small, not causing much loss. Oh, and now she regretted that she was so modest. Yes, in addition, there was an arrest. She spent all her income on clothes and jewelry. And Steve, of course. What's she going to be left with after the divorce? A pile of rags? A handful of knickknacks, that's all. And the big question was, would Steve be willing to do business with her? Olivia had no illusions about her lover's feelings. But what? She'd gotten away with one criminal case. She'd give up the other. And she managed to make the money disappear from all her husband's accounts. And Olivia vanished with her lover. They didn't wait for the police to take an interest in them. They left the country satisfied and happy that they were able to take revenge on the tyrant husband for the fact that he kept his poor wife practically in captivity for so long. Yes, that's how they interpreted Olivia's previous life to justify what they had done. After finding out he was left with nothing, Jack wasn't particularly worried. He was happy. He and Emily did explain themselves and realized that their separation had been a tragic mistake. They decided that they would still be together. After all, they already had 2 sons, and explained Jack and Emily without much trouble, because they both wanted to be together. They wanted to have a real complete family, and they still loved each other, so why hide it? And there was no point in bringing up old grudges. They'd been through too much since the breakup. The children took the change quite positively. When Matthew heard that he would have a father and a brother, he said that he'd always thought of Kevin as a brother and Uncle Jack as a father. Perhaps it was more difficult for Kevin in that regard. The boy already knew how difficult it was to establish a relationship with his mom. But having met Emily, he realized women can not only scold. The attitude of the new mom allowed the boy's heart to thaw. Jack, introducing Emily, told him to call her mom. Kevin did so simply because he was used to obeying his father, and there was no feeling in it at first. But not a month later, he asked, "Emily, are you going to be my real mom?" "Well, yes, I'll try," Emily replied and kissed the boy on the cheek. "Well, you always will be." "I'm only too glad," Kevin said. And so the family became truly complete and close-knit. Jack and Emily were officially married. They even had a wedding, though not particularly fancy, but very heartfelt. Jack, having become bankrupt, sold his firm, not chasing the price, paid the rest of the salaries to the employees and felt even relieved. Still, The burden of responsibility was too heavy. He was well aware that he could hardly get back what he had lost. And if that was the case, then there was no need to be upset. He was not going to sit idle anyway, and soon he got a job in another company on an ordinary position. Yes, he, a former successful businessman, was taken for the simplest job. Rumors about the bankruptcy of the company significantly undermined his reputation. But Jack was not discouraged, hoping for his knowledge and experience, and they did not fail. Soon he began to rise in the ranks. Not even a year later, when he reached the top manager, and the financial condition of the family was fully restored. All the more so because no one thought about excesses, as well as about his past. A new life had begun. And what was the use of reminiscing about the past? A year after the wedding, Emily told her husband and children the happy news. Soon their family will be added to one more little man. Jack, of course, rejoiced, but also worried. He was well aware of Emily's health problems. "Look, Emily, won't this be bad for you? After all, you've had 2 serious heart problems." "But they're solved. Don't get me wrong, I've already seen all the right doctors. They say there shouldn't be any problems. I'm sure everything will be fine, and our boys could use a little sister. Even if there is another brother, that's not bad at all. Don't you agree?" "I agree. I'm sure it wouldn't hurt either. I'm just worried about you." "Well, that's completely unnecessary. Don't worry and everything will be fine then," Emily smiled. The pregnancy went smoothly, and at the due date, Mia gave birth to a beautiful rich boy. Both mother and child were healthy, and the father and brothers were happy. In the daily happy cares, everyone did not care about the past. But one day it did come to mind. Jack went to Chicago to buy fruit for the children. Near the market, he noticed a slumped, poorly dressed woman collecting alms. He would never have recognized this beggar as Olivia, but at some point Mia looked up, fixed the scarf over her eyes, and he recognized his ex-wife. Olivia didn't recognize him. She didn't look at passers-by, but looked mostly only at her box, into which some particularly pitiful people threw change, and who threw it she was not interested. She only wondered whether she would have enough money for another round of liquor. Would she manage to forget herself tonight? And there was a lot to forget. But not her past happy life with her husband, or the way she had robbed him when she ran away. She regarded those as insignificant episodes. Other pictures kept running through her mind, namely how she had run away with her beloved to a warm land, how they were happily spending time at the overseas resort, and how one terrible day it turned out that Steve successfully divides his attention between Olivia and many other beauties, and she was left with less and less. At the time, the money was still in her hands. So she announced to Steve that she wanted to return to her homeland. "Great. They'll put you in jail there right away." Her lover tried to stop her. "What do you care? Going to jail. Then I'll sit there. Nobody's going to hurt you. We'll see." "Then how are the girls going to throw themselves at you when you're naked as a falcon?" Steve tried to object, argue, persuade, and even threaten her. And then apparently he made another decision. And then one day he disappeared, just like she did from Jack, took her to the cleaners. What was a poor woman to do in a foreign country, not knowing the language? Mia couldn't even go to the police. And what could she tell them? She had to sell the last thing she had and return to her native Chicago alone. For a while she had a crazy hope that Steve would come back too, and they could. But that, of course, didn't happen. Settled in Chicago without money, without housing, without relatives and friends, she realized that her situation is hopeless, and she was already dreaming of being detained and sent to prison. This was at least a way out. But it turned out that no one was looking for her and was not going to judge her. No one wanted her or cared about her. And then there was some time when she wandered around with different men, often marginalized, and as a result she was left with only one way out, to sit near the market, collecting pennies for another dose of alcohol. Jack, of course, didn't know the ins and outs of her life after the escape, but he wasn't interested in them. It was a shame, but not as much. After all, she'd gotten what she deserved. He didn't go up to her to ask her anything, or talk about anything. He just bought a bag of groceries, put it next to her, and left. At home, he decided not to say anything about the encounter. There was no need for his family to know about this woman. He himself would have loved to know nothing. "Mommy, can you hear me? Are you there?" Yes, I'm sorry, daughter. You know that when I'm after work, I can easily fall out of the conversation. Holly tried to keep her voice calm. Dennis and my son and I will come to you for the holidays. Or do you have other plans? You tell me right away, and I'll quickly change mine. I don't know about Dad's plans, Holly exhaled. All I know is that they're beautiful. He left me, found a beautiful young woman, and announced it almost honestly. They've been serious for a long time. So we're officially divorced. I'm sorry to break the news on New Year's Eve. You know I'm not good at hiding things from you. Mommy, I'm coming to see you. I'm going to wait for Dennis to get home from work. Take a cab and come over. It's been so long since we've had a late-night chat. Jane, I'm fine. You don't have to leave a 1-year-old baby at night because of me. It's not going to make me feel any better. Mom, that baby has a dad who's an adequate, responsible, modern father. You can fool anyone with your voice, but not me. In an hour and a half, I'm sure you'll be expecting me. Holly listened to 3 quick beeps in the receiver and tried to smile helplessly. She was lucky to have a daughter. Not everyone was so lucky. Holly learned about the difficulties of the transition age only from other people's stories. She was friends with little Jane and continued to be friends with the almost grown-up Jane. She also managed to avoid worrying about her daughter's first love dramas. There were no dramas. Jane took her studies seriously. In the second year, she found a job and managed to combine one thing with another. And by the end of the institute, saved up for a vacation to long-desired Italy. Of course, her parents added a little. And it happened. As in the song, quite by accident, we took tickets to the neighboring seat at a high altitude. The daughter met her future husband on the airplane. Venice, Florence, Rome. 6 months of meetings upon returning home, followed by a wedding and the birth of a child. Holly delighted in the role of caring grandmother and seemed to herself almost perfectly happy. She had always felt so comfortable and at ease in the family of Jane and Dennis. In the midst of their warm love and beautiful, almost wordless understanding of each other. It's good that my daughter is not repeating my fate, she thought gratefully one day on the subway coming back from her son-in-law's daughter's house, and she was startled at her own thoughts. What could she be dissatisfied with? She and Ben have an absolutely normal life for a couple with a long history. They do not scandalize, do not even argue on matters of principle, live peacefully. Ben earns good money and knows how to manage money wisely. She is, in general, lucky with her husband. Except for that eternal feeling of the last few years that something important is missing. In the very real love that any woman expects to meet, she had not been particularly lucky since her youth. She just accepted it calmly. After all, to be honest, there are plenty of women like her around, far more than those lucky enough to be truly loved, not for a honeymoon but for life. And until noon yesterday, Holly thought her married life was a success. She put all her heart and soul into her family and didn't consider it a sacrifice at all. She herself is pleased to take care of her husband, to arrange a cozy home where both want to rush from work. Their apartment is neither bigger nor cozier in layout than that of friends and good acquaintances, but on holidays everyone likes to gather at their place. She always has everything so well arranged. Ben's buddies often showed a joking envy. He seriously took taking care of himself for granted. Could it be any other way? If it could be, it wasn't for him. For the last couple of years, Ben had been busy building and finishing a country house, devoting all his spare time to it. He wanted not just a house, but a full-fledged, comfortable dwelling, where you can live all year round if you want. Holly had no time to go and look at the construction site every week, and at first she was very worried about it, but Ben waved it off. Come on, you want to be everywhere. It's better for everyone if you're in charge here, and I'm in charge there. Holly realized, or she thought she realized, that he really needed something of his own, where he was the boss. Yesterday morning she had suddenly felt sick, weak at work, and her head ached so badly that the usual pill didn't help at all. Apparently she did not look well at all, because even the chief, who was called indifferent, looked at her and said, "Holly, sometimes it's better to stay home for a couple days than to take 2 weeks sick leave. Go home and get some rest. You'll be back at work the day after tomorrow. It won't affect your paycheck. I don't want a lot of exhausted employees. I'm not a despot, as some people claim." Holly nodded gratefully and went home. How wrong we sometimes are in our judgments about people. especially if they are superiors who are generally disliked. Holly quietly, trying not to make any noise, entered the apartment. Ben arrived at night after a business trip. His sleep should not be disturbed, but Ben was awake. From the living room, a conversation was heard. Judging by the absence of the interlocutor's voice, Ben was talking on the phone. Holly did not immediately even realize that it was her husband speaking. The voice and intonation was as if it wasn't his. "My sweet sunshine, I'm coming over today. My old lady is pickling tomatoes after work today, according to a new recipe. The recipes are new every year, but my wife is old. I'm sorry I'm talking nonsense just to be witty. Honestly, I'll get my act together soon and tell you. I appreciate you and I'm happy you don't want to spend New Year's Eve without me. I'll decide before New Year's, I promise. I swear, my little girl. Don't be a child, understand my situation. It's not easy for me. It's more than 25 years of my life. We raised our daughter together. 5 more years and she'll look old, but she's all about family. The pantry's already bursting. She wants everything to be up to par. If I leave, she'll be all alone. There'll be no one to take care of her. I don't really care. I don't want to spend the rest of my life hanging out with men just to get away from my boring wife. I need joy in my life, and my joy is you. Holly hesitated for some reason to turn on the light in the hallway. It was enough light from the entryway, hitting the mirror, to see this woman gray, exhausted. That's what she is, no one's rival. And her husband pities her, too. Old, pathetic. If she didn't have such a headache, she would run out into the street, just to wander somewhere, until evening, or until she gets herself under control and regains her ability to think clearly. No, she wouldn't even have the strength to go down the stairs. She wanted to shut the door quietly, out of a ridiculous desire to listen to the conversation, but her husband heard the sound. He said goodbye and went out into the hallway. I decided not to make tomatoes if you basically don't care. Her strength was only enough for this ultimatum. Maybe it's for the best that you heard everything. I really hate lying to you. I should have ended it anyway. You're a good person, and I'm sorry to you. But there's no point in continuing it. Holly nonchalantly affirmed. It's nice that at least you recognize your old lady as a human being. Holly, but why the poison? Let's be honest. I'm only 53. I'm not ready to be a grandfather. I have a need for love. And why should I give it up? We raised our daughter, and we haven't had much of a connection since. You just refuse to see it, clinging to this meaningless semblance of a marriage that's like everyone else's. If you're willing to look and live like an old lady, that's your right and your choice. Take care of your granddaughter. You have someone to take care of. I would have lived like that too, like a lot of people my age. But I was lucky enough to be loved by a young, beautiful woman, and I loved her very much. Not everyone is so lucky. It's a new life, a real life. You can't give that up. It's a gift. You see, it's only now that I'm realizing how miserable I've been. This is my chance to start over. You won't be disadvantaged in any way. You're the mother of my daughter. I'm keeping this apartment for you. I won't take anything from here except my clothes and shoes. I'll live in the house with her. It's not for nothing that I've invested so much in this place. Apparently, fate has guided you don't drive a car and you haven't invested any money in it. So it's logical that it stays with me. They'll give you some money for the first time. We'll discuss the amount. It's called a kickback, Holly commented. What if I ask for too much? I said, we'll talk about it. Ben repeated patiently. You're so in love and so sensible. You've thought about everything for a long time, but you lack determination. And so everything is on top. Strategist. Holly, let's be human. In case you haven't noticed, I didn't bark at you doggy style. I don't need to have this conversation at all. I came home with a headache, and in situations like this, I lie in a warm bath. It helps. While I'm in the bath, get your stuff, your papers. What else you got? Thoughtfully, so you don't have to come back here for something you forgot. And leave the keys and file for divorce yourself. I don't like to go to court. You know I won't drag this out to spite you. Set a date, I'll come at the appointed day and hour, and we'll get divorced. No money. I've got a decent salary for me alone. Just don't show up. The day of the divorce is the last time I'll ever see you. And if you want to play the noble, give your share of the apartment to Jane, so that your lovers don't disinherit the girl. You have to admit, it's only fair. Mom, were you thinking about my inheritance at that moment? Quietly amazed Jane, listening to her story. Who should I be thinking about, daughter? Holly shrugged. A sad grin crept across her pale face. When such things come, you have to grasp at straws that will keep you from losing interest in life. I'm lucky to have you and Dennis. I promise not to torture you too much, not to turn into the annoying old woman your father thinks I am. I've been sitting here thinking. He's right about something. I always made sure he was well-fed, warmly clothed, rested comfortably, was surrounded by comfort. It was like a home service. I thought it was the right thing to do in a family. I didn't realize that's not what he needed. I should have thought more about myself, tried to be charming, and things might have turned out differently. Although there's no point in talking about it now. You're justifying him, then? Jane asked. To be honest, you surprise me with this habit of always blaming yourself. It's too much. I didn't tell you, but I'll tell you now. My father and I had a conversation about 3 years ago after New Year's Eve when he gave you a blender for New Year's Eve. A good blender. It still works now, nodded her daughter. But it's not a gift, it's just a thing to buy when you need it. I suddenly remembered that for every holiday your father gives you something practical and useful, everyday things. That's what I told him. He was so surprised, as if it was the first time he heard that you can give perfume and jewelry or theater tickets. Some kind of spa visit. Something that would emphasize that he thinks of you as a woman, wants to see you beautiful and satisfied. But my dad didn't hear me, even took offense at me, saying that I hadn't gotten rid of my naive dreams yet. I didn't think much of it at the time. Well, I tried, but it didn't work. And now it comes to mind. And he himself was comfortable that you're so, on the care of yourself, almost no money to spend. Who needs a beautiful, well-groomed wife? He'll take care of it himself. And whoever just wants a comfortable wife, that's how he behaves. I wish Daddy would spend all his earnings on his incomparable beauty. You even cheered me up, Holly smiled confusedly. I didn't realize I had you like that. I just love you very much, and I feel bad for you. You certainly don't deserve this. All of Dennis' friends are jealous that he has such a mother-in-law. They joke that you're the reason he married me. Dad's just used to luxury care, taken it for granted all his life. He'll definitely regret it. You'll see. I don't want him to regret anything. Let him go in peace. Thank you, Jane. My kitten. Don't fight with Daddy. You're a grown-up, diplomatic man. You realize he's still your father, right? Our divorce is our divorce. It has nothing to do with you. Besides, he's vowed to take care of your inheritance before the divorce. So I'm sure I won't change my mind and start dragging things out. Don't worry, Mommy, I won't refuse, Jane assured him with a smile, looking at her mother's palm. Just so that some monster doesn't get it. And I admire your self-control. I never realized you were so strong. Holly's tears suddenly sprang from her eyes as if an invisible dam had burst. Daughter, I don't understand myself. I wanted to scream, to beg, something like, don't leave me. Let's try to fix everything. I'll forgive everything. Forget everything. Take everything into account. Only if you stay. But something kept me back. It was a shame to cry in front of him. You're the one I trust, and I'm crying in front of you. And I'm not ashamed. Too many drunks. Not good. Not likely to show up here much. Me neither. Listen, Holly, when this dance is over, let's go and sit somewhere cozy and talk. I'd like that, shall we? Holly really wanted to get out of here. And the guy seemed serious and nice. And she'd never been asked out before, except by her girlfriends. By the end of the evening, Holly had learned a few things about the guy. He's a young specialist in railroad production, an engineer. He has his own apartment, inherited from his grandfather, but he dreams of building his own house. He's the only son of his parents, from a full family. He doesn't like discos very much either. They play pop music, but he listens to heavy rock. I don't know why he decided to see what his ex-girlfriend was doing in those places. Yeah, it's definitely an ex-girlfriend. It was a stupid idea. but at least he met her. The girl didn't think there was any interest in meeting her. She just sits there and listens to his story, saying almost nothing herself. But it seemed Ben just needed to speak up. He walked Holly home and managed to earn his mom's approval. She liked that the guy wasn't being cryptic. He waited for his mother to open the door and handed Holly to her hand in hand. Well-mannered, and not like these modern informals or hooligans. The next day a friend, Svetlana, ran in and told her that she had seen her in the company of a new acquaintance. It turned out that Ben was just using her for a performance. He was ostentatiously courting her in front of her ex-girlfriend, Helga. She couldn't shake off her sadness for 2 whole days. On the 3rd night there was a short ring at the door. It was Mom who opened it. She was expecting a girlfriend, but on the doorstep stood Ben with a small bouquet and a cake. On that evening they began dating. Holly quickly fell in love with him, angry at herself for it, and tried not to think about why he really wanted her, especially since her mom comforted her, telling her not to believe the gossip. Holly listened to her mother in silence, objecting only to herself so as not to upset her. Ben, and there was nothing to compare yet. They were just meeting as friends. It was enough for her that this guy was in her life. That's how it lasted until the summer, until his birthday. It was warm days and nights, celebrating the holiday at the guy's house. There were only his parents and Ben's friend and his wife, who had just returned from a wedding trip down south. For Holly, it was a day of getting to know Ben's parents. Her mother thought it was a good sign that he was serious, and had even spent half her paycheck on a cocktail dress for her daughter. Although for the countryside it was quite possible to get by with something simpler. Holly said so to her mother. Mom was amazed to learn that her not too confident daughter, it turns out, is not afraid of the upcoming acquaintance. Holly's boldness was explained simply she did not believe that all this would last long. One day Ben would disappear as quickly as he had appeared. If he doesn't return to Helga, he'll meet a new love. He's too handsome and promising for her, and he probably realizes it himself. That's what the girlfriends hinted. That's what the girl herself thought. Of course, deep down she still wanted to believe that it was not them, but her mother who was right. Such a happy evening like that had never happened in her life before. She behaved as usual, just happy about Ben's holiday and her parents' love for her. Both her father and mother and her friend Roman liked her, with absolutely no effort at all. Never before had she felt such ease. The closer the day leaned toward evening, the more her confidence grew that this day was made for something special. Her parents had gone into town for the night, promising to stop by her mom's house. The newlyweds had discreetly secluded themselves in the attic that had been prepared for them, and Ben and Holly were left alone by the brazier with its almost transparent corners. Ben seemed delighted to be joined with them. He placed a bottle of expensive champagne, given to him for his birthday by his boss, on the table. All that night they spent together, and in the morning Ben, having seen his friends off, drove Holly home himself. He pulled up in front of the store, jumped out of the car, and returned 5 minutes later with a bouquet of burgundy roses. "Did you ask her to marry him?" "No, Mom, he didn't. But it was really nice. Just don't swear, or at least not today." "She will." Mom promised confidently, "I can see that, and I'm not in the mood to fight today or tomorrow. Do you think your mother is a prude?" They hugged each other and laughed quietly, relieved. There was no tomorrow to look forward to. In the evening, the family of the guy in full formed on the doorstep of his and his mother's apartment. His father, putting delicacies on the table, announced that they were old-fashioned people, so they decided to ask for the girl's hand in a domestic setting. But the wedding will be already in a restaurant, and according to all the canons. Then, in the early 90s, many girls still dreamed of a chic, large and solemn wedding. But Holly was not one of them. She wanted the kind of wedding that her daughter Jane had a quarter of a century later. Light, small and elegant for those closest to her, but with a honeymoon trip that would be remembered for a lifetime. But no one had asked her opinion about her own wedding, and she hadn't even noticed. She was sitting at the table, discussing something with her mom and future mother-in-law, and couldn't believe that all this was happening to her. Her beloved Ben wants to see her as his wife. She will make sure he will never regret it. Ben hasn't felt as happy as he does now in a long time, as his divorce from his indifferent, aging wife went off like clockwork. Things had worked out much easier than he had imagined for himself. Holly had done without scandals, threats, and tantrums, even without tears. Maybe she'd been living with him out of inertia for a long time, too. That would absolve him of some of the guilt of abandoning his wife. And yet, it seemed hurtful, acutely hurt his ego. He considered himself the center of the world, and she was letting him go for nothing. He feared that the family had saved an unpleasant surprise for the day of the divorce, but everything was as mundane as a visit to the therapist. Spouses who have no minor children and property claims are divorced without a court. Ex-wife kept her word, given on the day of his departure no claims, if the interests of the daughter will be respected. She came to the divorce indifferent and some kind of refreshed. She looked at Ben without reproach, as at a neighbor in a cramped subway car as soon as possible to get out and make room. When they left the building, already divorced, she said goodbye indifferently and walked away, not looking like a lost and unhappy person from behind. Ben had a stupid feeling that he had not had a good time getting to know his ex-wife. Wow, now ex-wife. I wonder how long she'd been practicing that independent look. His friends called him a fool when they found out he was making a drastic change in his life. Some directly and harshly, some diplomatically. The point didn't change. He didn't even take offense because he felt right. Some of them are driven by jealousy. It's enough to show a photo of his sweetheart to ignite that envy. Someone just never had such a feeling, does not understand or has forgotten for what a man all the achievements and victories. He was like that himself. He thought it was normal to return home to his wife to grow old together imperceptibly. They just all live in hibernation, and he suddenly woke up. Dad was right in his day. Ben has never once regretted marrying Holly over the years. He had only started dating her to show Helga that he too could be looked at with the kind of adoration he looked at her with. Ben's value in her eyes didn't increase at all. But he suddenly realized that he wasn't really upset that his attitude toward Helga had long ago grown into some kind of bad habit and had let go of the obsession of the last 2 years. He was grateful to Holly for that. In her company, he felt so cozy and confident that it was very difficult, and even unnecessary, to give up this pleasant feeling. Holly did not demand anything from him, just enjoyed his company. The parents noticed the change in their son it was impossible not to notice. He stopped being nervous and snapping for nothing, did not disappear at night, organized the regime and remembered about the interest in work and career. Even the expression on his face was different. For 2 years they had been worried about what good could come out of their son's stupid love for a girl of easy behavior, who only wanted to sell herself more expensive. Now they were silently rejoicing, afraid to jinx the unclear prospects with questions, and were also grateful to the unknown girl. Of course, my mother did her best and made some inquiries. Ben usually avoided discussing his personal life with his father. They were too different, and his father never liked his previous choices categorically. But after his 27th birthday, when he introduced Holly to his family, he had approached, "We need to talk." The father tried to be persuasive. "Oh, a girl at almost 25. Wow, in this day and age. And no worse than that ex of yours. Mother and I noticed the way she looks at you. You'll always know you're welcome home and cared for. In time, you'll appreciate that. If I were you, I'd marry her right away. You won't regret it. You'll remember my words with gratitude when I'm gone. And there'll be no escaping the whoremongers. You'll have enough for your lifetime, if you wish." And Ben got married. Dad and Mom are gone. It is unlikely that he would have been able to realize his life-changing twist if they were alive, or would have had to hide his divorce from Holly for the rest of his life. His own or his parents, they would never have understood or accepted. They loved her like their own daughter. And most surprisingly, she loved them sincerely too. Sometimes he missed his parents, but now he was relieved that his new love would not have to face the undeserved dislike of his relatives. Since there were no relatives except Jane, her daughter didn't want to meet her. "She's only a few years older than you. You must have something in common." "Dad, if I had to live in the same apartment with your girlfriend, I'd look for something in common with her, so I wouldn't complicate my life with negativity. I don't see the need. Sorry, we may never cross paths in our lives. I'm guessing your woman would be fine with that too. I've already agreed not to hurt your feelings or say mean things to you. And this is quite difficult for me now, and don't complicate my life even more, please." Ben understood the daughter had always been closer to her mother than to him, so there was nothing to be surprised about. But Diane was upset because she refused to meet him. "I'm not even upset with myself, I'm upset with you. Your daughter does not want to make even the slightest effort to understand the feelings of her father, who did everything for her and continues to do. It's so natural to accept a gift of a share in an apartment, but to do something nice for her father is an impossible task. She was so genuinely upset that Ben had to console her for a long time, and the next day to please her with a visit to a country restaurant. She is so life-loving, so fond of pleasure, so happy at every surprise and gift, so giving her love after a day full of entertainment, that any of his sorrows pale in comparison with this happiness. Happiness is, now remembered suddenly a precise phrase read somewhere. The first 2 months of a free life. Holly struggled with her old way of life, tried to reshape it. At first, she latched onto the simplest thing. Guys, why don't I come down every weekend and spend the whole day walking around and doing zines? And you two can be alone together. But the guys rejected the offer. They wanted to raise their daughter on their own. Don't be offended, we'd rather go somewhere as a family sometimes with you and Zena. The cultural program invented for her was very interesting but not happy. Holly felt like a wedding general or a dressed-up bear when her daughter or a friend brought her to the theater or to an exhibition with a new hairstyle and in new dresses. They try to entertain her, and she, unable to genuinely rejoice, walks around, red as jam. I'm ashamed of myself. Listen, it's like you're making titanic efforts on yourself. Shrewd Helly sparkled. Don't pretend for our sake. Think about what you really want for yourself. Holly confessed, and the girls convinced her to go on vacation, not to the cottage, where she was eager to help her mother Dennis grow, harvest and prepare crops, but to a real vacation. In April, Holly flew to Egypt. 10 days away from home, like on another planet. That's what she was really happy about. She did the math. She hadn't been to the sea in 12 years. She went every year with little Jane. And then Ben started building a house, and the house ate up almost all the finances. Jane had been going to the sea alone ever since, to children's and youth camps. Holly vacationed alone, avoiding noisy companies. And it didn't weigh her down in the slightest. Perhaps we should go on vacation every year. It is possible even in the off-season, and not for the beach, to walk through different old towns, through quaint markets, through narrow streets. She came back feeling completely refreshed, and immediately fell from ship to ball. It was good that there were still a few days of vacation left, while she was running around with her worldly upheavals. She completely forgot the matchmakers have a 30-year wedding anniversary. Pearl's wedding is the day after her return, and she didn't even bring a present. Just some oriental sweets and fruit teas. But the daughter who met her laughed. She knew it, and she had already bought everything from both of them. But the matchmakers celebrated the wedding at the campground. Of those invited, almost no one was surprised. Dennis's parents did not like flashy restaurants. They were natural people. Both of them were fond of fishing and long walks in beautiful places. Holly even exhaled deeply in relief when she recognized that the events did not require meticulously chosen dresses, heels, elaborate hair and makeup. She began to suddenly understand her friend Lena, who was growing weary of it all. Instead of a long morning gathering on the day of the anniversary, she properly slept, leisurely drank coffee, and gladly dressed in loose beige pants and snow-white t-shirt from Egypt, on which 3 camels dancing on the background of the pyramids. The weather is unusually warm now for April. It doesn't happen often, but you have to throw on a tight windswept hair she just let loose over her shoulders. So be it. They say women over 40 shouldn't wear their hair long. Whoever made that up, let them not wear it. And she'd completely forgotten that her honey Karen eye was so tan herself in the mirror. Holly liked her. I don't remember exactly when it started. Probably on vacation. There, some heavy lump in her chest unnoticeably dissolved, and she felt like she just liked living. Soon her children would pick her up, and her vacation would continue with a holiday at the matchmakers. Soon it would be New Year's Eve again. It seemed like just yesterday they were celebrating the previous one. It is necessary to think of gifts, to plan something interesting. But there was neither strength nor ideas. Ben was so exhausted for the last year, as he had never been tired, probably since his senior year, when he combined work with business trips and diploma. But when he'd been a kid, he'd had an easier time of it. Diane had noticed recently that he used to be a man of celebration, but now he was completely dull and boring, despite her best efforts. At the word effort, Ben even perked up because he was surprised. It seemed to him that all the efforts applied just him. Yes, and simply lives on everything ready. And he doesn't mind. But she must realize that for the eternal celebration of his strength is no longer enough. I'm not a showman. I'm the chief engineer of the project, Sonny, he joked. No, she has nothing to reproach him with. She's just too sensitive, and she's young. For her, it is important to have an eventful life, new impressions. She was counting on him to give her all that. Here, I'm thinking about where to take Diane for New Year's Eve. Ben shared his thoughts with his old friend James, having stopped by his cottage for a cup of tea. I can't think of anything yet. We will fly to the Emirates in March. It has long been decided. I can't afford 2 trips in 3 months. There are some fundamental problems with the house. You've become wooden. I understand, of course, that active love makes you thin, but in your case, it's not that. You're busy, like a working housewife with 2 children, my friend said scathingly. As the owner, who didn't need to leave the house today, he'd had enough whiskey to make him want to be frank. Thanks for the support and advice, buddy, Ben said, hurt by the comparison. You're welcome. Who else will tell the truth but an old friend? Let's get back to specifics. How would you like to celebrate the new year yourself? I would have stayed at home, Ben grinned. We would invite you, Kat, and decorate the tree. We used to celebrate every year like that. What was bad? The lineup changes, James said. And we're already invited. We're not going to say no. I'm sorry. Listen, why don't you and your beauty meet at home together? I mean, you two shouldn't get bored of each other yet. Romantic areas, candles, pillows. We spent New Year's Eve at home last year because we didn't have time to book anything decent with the divorce. You know how messed up that was. And on a second gray New Year's Eve, Diane might take offense. Your problems are far from me, to be honest, James said. I don't know what to advise you. Look, what if you don't show originality and go to work? She'd be less bored and more appreciative of the pleasures of a simple vacation. Don't give me that look. I'm not suggesting that she should be hauling sleepers and sitting at the checkout and the supermarket, or even keep an eye on the sack conveyor belt. She's got some fine maiden profession. She had a life before you. She's not a schoolgirl after all. She worked in a flower boutique, I told you. I told you it was a fine profession. Give her a course for New Year's Eve to train to be a top-notch creative florist. That's what it's called, isn't it? After which she'll get a job at some cool place. I'm dead serious, by the way. Show you really care with a gift like this. It's become very difficult for friends to find common ground. Over the years, they have a lot less in common than they did when they were younger. I'll think about it, Ben said tiredly. He was not ready to distance himself from his old friend. After the meeting with James, he had planned to stop by his sick colleague's house to pick up some paperwork and discuss some things, but he suddenly decided to postpone the visit. He wanted to go home. Called, rescheduled. In the morning, I felt I'd done the right thing. I stopped by my favorite candy store and wine market. Tomorrow's Friday. What's stopping me from starting today? Driving home. He remembered that he'd forgotten to call Diane, to tell her he'd be an hour and a half early. Oh, well, it would be a surprise. The light was on in the living room, but a quiet, melodious voice could be heard from the dark veranda. It was one of her funny habits to chat with her girlfriends in the evening on the phone on the open veranda, looking only at the chain of streetlights along the highway. In the summer, it was understandable. In winter, it didn't seem too comfortable, but she assured me it was fine, throwing on her fur coat. Not to listen to my serious lover are nonsense. Shrugged her shoulders. Ben a couple or 3 times still unobtrusively overheard. He wondered what she was talking about with others, not with him. It was really insignificant girl talk, nonsense. They advised each other manicures, swimming pool, bragged about gifts. The girl appeared very content with her life in these conversations. It pleased him, and he didn't listen to them anymore. Now she was chattering to light rhythmic music and therefore did not hear or see Ben drive up. The garage was on the other side of the house. He walked along the wall toward the veranda to the voice of the sounding brook until he began to discern individual words in himself. I think of him very often, right in the details. All the nicest things I imagine what would happen if I dared. And I realize he can't give me anything but that. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying, Yul. I really don't want to be a short-sighted fool who ruins everything for a nice little fling. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's why I haven't decided to see him alone yet. And I probably never will. I just hope guys aren't chasing guys these days. Maybe he'll call one more time and then stop. I can't take that chance. You're right, kitten. I'm not that good at faking it. Mine may be a little old for me, but he's reliable. Yeah, he's asking me to marry him. I'll say yes. You don't throw those options away. He'll definitely do anything for me. Not like those guys who already split a restaurant bill. Thanks, Kitty, for listening to me. I kept you late. Yeah, and I'm freezing. I'm gonna go to my cabin. Bye, 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 kisses. The door slammed as the coffin board rattled overhead. The light footsteps of the jar hushed the hallway. Ben stood, touching his forehead to the icy wall of his house. When had it gotten so cold? It had been warm not so long ago. It's a good thing she's such a chattering fool. Otherwise he'd marry her and put her in his will. I don't doubt that's the right and manly thing to do. Jane will still get the apartment, and her husband is quite a well-to-do and prosperous family, and she has only him alone. Yes, the girl convinced him of this so discreetly that he was sure it was his own decision. So she's not the fool here. He had fallen into a well-known ancient trap like many before him, and he would not dare to enter his own house and throw her out like a mischievous cat. It was good for him to be with her. He was good with her. Even if it was self-deception. He should give her money, just to give her the money he had saved for a vacation with her in the Emirates. Isn't that a pity? She deserves it. It's just enough until she finds a job and goes back to her mom to live. She's got a place to live, she won't go to waste. Or at least she'll be happy to have a spicy new romance out of wedlock. He'll call her a cab. Left alone, Ben reached for the bottle of expensive sparkling wine he had brought today. Well, let's celebrate. He had never believed in the law of the boomerang, considered it a consolation for losers. He believed that everyone gets only what they can get for themselves. The rest was mystical. No, it's not. That mysticism had a place in his real life. What did Holly feel then, listening to his phone conversation? Only a year had passed and he'd gotten his boomerang light and fast. Fate had spared him yet. He hadn't had time to marry and dump a lot of money into her welfare, and Holly had lived with him for a quarter of a century. And his fatigue was always gone. When he came home, he had all the things that make up the warm prosperity that many only dream of reaching for. He got, without the slightest effort, completely undeservedly, everything he had worked so hard to earn for the last year. His father was right. He had never regretted his choice, so reasonable, so convenient. Now there was no father, no mother, no friends. Only Holly's friends now. There was only one place left on earth he could go now, if he was accepted there. He'd do anything to be accepted. No, not now, not in this sorry state. To think things over, to sleep, to work, to find the words. He'd honestly left the keys to their shared apartment in the mailbox the day he left, so he had to wait a couple hours for Holly to get home. Ben found a parking space around the corner of a nearby office center, left the car there, and went for a walk. And she herself didn't call him either, even wished him happy birthday by text. And he didn't even give it a second thought. Nothing will make up for it. Jane can't stay mad for long, can't play Snow Queen. She's a lot like her mom. Ben realized he was drinking his third cup of espresso at the mall coffee shop. Time to go check it out. Surely the wife must have gotten home by now. Indeed, there was a light on in the living room kitchen windows. Ben hesitantly hesitated in front of the intercom, but a couple of minutes later the door to the entryway opened, and out jumped a skinny old woman with a small dog and a brightly colored harness under her armpit, some subtly familiar figure from his neighbors. Ignoring the granny's condescendingly mocking glance, he entered the entryway unnoticed by himself, and found himself on his customary third floor at the light gray door, then rang the bell, which he fumbled for without looking. Holly opened almost at once. It seemed to him that at first she wanted to slam the door shut before he could get in, but then for some reason she changed her mind. She had recently returned from somewhere, probably from a party, because between her and the threshold stood a pair of dainty boots in a puddle of snow, which Ben hesitated to step over until she waved her head lightly. Come in. What happened? It was Holly, and yet completely not her at the same time. She had never been heavy-set, always just a woman of average height and build, but now she looked as light and casually graceful as a young girl. She had contrived to dye her hair a dark chocolate shade that went so well with the unusual warm color of her eyes and skin tone. And her hair was not gathered in a sleek, comfortable ponytail at the back of her head, but was loose over her shoulders in a sort of artistic mess, like in the paintings of Renaissance masters. She was wearing a simple, flowing burgundy knee-length dress with a frivolous neckline, emphasizing her slender waist. One could stare at her like fire for a long time. She'd gotten 10 years younger at least since he'd left her. Anyone would say now that the woman in front of him was a beautiful, attractive woman. That's what Ben said. "You've become very beautiful." "Wow." "Thank you," Holly replied, smiling politely, as if she had been told that every day her whole life. She paused briefly, waiting for him to say something else, but he remained silent. And then she continued softly, without irritation. "Listen, Ben, if there's any important business for me, tell me at once. I'm waiting for guests. You don't call, you don't warn me. And I have my own plans. I can't give you much time right now. I'm sorry. Could you forgive me?" He breathed out his question. "So I have long since forgiven you," she smiled with peaceful surprise. "You did not go for career in some secret society, which requires an official forgiveness of ex-wives, certified by a notary. You should only call your daughter more often. She may never admit it, but she misses you." "Really?" "Let's get to the point. What's your reason for coming here?" "I want you and our family back. I want to make things right. I was an idiot. I made a dead-end mistake, and I admit it outright. I hope I didn't realize it too late, because I haven't done anything legal. I understand that you haven't been expecting this for a long time in your feminine ego. I understand that you need to take a break. Think it over calmly and tell me when I can come over. I'm really sorry things didn't work out with your young friend. You were so enthusiastic I can't bear to call you a sneak or anything like that. And it doesn't make any sense now. I have someone I love. We're adults. After my stupid prank, you had a right to get revenge. You proved to me how wrong I was in a big way. Let's just agree not to relive any of these adventures. You misunderstood me, or rather, you didn't hear me. I didn't say I wanted to prove anything to you or to myself, much less to take revenge. You should have realized after all these years that I wouldn't do such nonsense, much less go looking for a passing fancy. The woman and her daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter arrived early for the matchmaker's wedding. Dennis always left for a long journey in advance. He assured half seriously, half jokingly, that his girls would forget something and still have to go back. And then they would ask to stop 10 times to walk around and take photos in beautiful places. That's more or less how it was. But it didn't prevent the family from always arriving before the set time. Immediately, everyone went to assess the campground, chatting merrily. Zoe loved water of all kinds, shapes, and temperatures, and was already running quite well. So she had to be watched with both eyes and reacted to her ideas promptly. Zoe ran as maneuverably as bats fly, suddenly changing her trajectory. After her thoughtful vacation, Holly was a little weaned from the fast pace of life and let her guard down. In April, it was mostly roach, as far as she could remember from the stories of the matchmakers, and it seems to be caught from the shore. She didn't expect that a rubber boat would be hidden in the light between the bushes, and that her granddaughter would jump into it. Holly had a kind of stupor at any unexpected danger, and it was pointless to fight nature. And then a silent fisherman in boots materialized from somewhere. He entered the water and deftly, gently extracted the sim from the boat. She was not frightened or upset, just giggled and showed him her tongue. "Hello, take it please." The man with laughing eyes held out his granddaughter. "Thank you," Holly replied, dropping the days. And both laughed briefly, meeting each other's gazes. The fisherman had a neat short beard, highlighted by silver, hair and merry gray eyes. "Excuse us," Holly told him, and added, "For some reason we're here for a wedding anniversary. Only too early, so we get into all sorts of adventures. We're waiting for the others." "Everyone here is like that," Fisherman announced, "including me. I'm Andrew, a classmate of the Happy Jubilee. It's better to go straight to Andy." She introduced herself, too, and so they became a couple. From that day on, they sat next to each other at the table, talking about everything, dancing only with each other on the creaking wooden dancing terrace. No one paid any attention to it, as if it went without saying that they were a couple and everyone was used to it. It was so strange and funny, and it was like they really knew each other a long time ago. And there was no fear that they might say or do something wrong, ruin everything. Her son-in-law's mother, putting her granddaughter to bed, told her we were young almost every day to communicate, and then fate scattered us in different cities. He has lived far away for many years, and still every year he comes to us, then we to him. It's strange that you two haven't crossed paths until now. Yeah, well, we've never celebrated any anniversary this big. It was always just the two of us. I knew his wife well. Her name was Iron, too. 7 years ago, she died of a heart condition. They didn't tell anyone, but now I think that's why they didn't have children. They didn't want to risk it. Andrew was all alone, really alone. Random girlfriends are out of character for him. He needs someone to look after him. Of course, he's self-sufficient, and being alone hasn't changed him for the worse. But he's not happy about it. There's a reason we wanted to have a company wedding. Something was driving us. Looks like we're a Cupid family now. If someone had told me yesterday that I could be in this situation, I would have laughed incredulously. Maybe even a little offended at being laughed at. The girl fell fast asleep, and they returned to their guests. The wedding was honored by the staunchest guests until morning. Long gone from the tables, people divided into interest groups and flocked under the shoreline canopies to bonfires or in the gazebo at the edge of the woods. Andrew walked Holly around the lake in the boat. She dozed in the pre-dawn mist. By noon, all the anniversary guests had departed, and the two of them stayed on the lake for a couple more days. Why does everyone think that roach is a bland, tasteless fish that is only good for dried fish? It was delicious, a delicacy. And then Andrew went to his place in Kaliningrad and called every day, and came for weekends twice a month. And she'd already gone to see him a few times. The last time was early December. Slow, lazy snow fell vertically along the cathedral walls. Holly had arrived wearing thin gloves, and Andrew had brought her soft woolen mittens from the market. Now, in this cold, he announced that the mittens would have to be removed for a little while. With careful tenderness, he put on her ring finger a ring with a ruby, which he had already hidden in his palm for a long time, and immediately put her hand back into the mitten. If you agree to marry me, it's an engagement ring, and if not, it's just a gift from the heart. Back home and meeting with her daughter, telling her news, Holly was shy and tried to appear a judicious lady, weighing the pros and cons. I've worked at this agency for so many years. It's all its own and all its own. I know from experience how long it takes women my age to find a job in my specialty. To employers, we're like pensioners. Not everyone understands the benefits. Mom, come on. Recruitment agencies like yours are not exclusive. How many times have you thought about changing jobs? Here's your chance. What about you two as a family? Holly was hesitant to make another argument that should have seemed compelling. You're used to me being the go-to guy, and if you need anything, I'm here. Argument. I'm sorry, Mom. It's not that you and your help aren't important. It's just that you know very well that we're not helpless enough to make my young, beautiful mom a full-time grandmother. As far as our benefit is concerned, we already have a pearl couple of grandparents here, but we don't have any in other very interesting cities, and that's a shame. A happy grandmother in Kaliningrad is her own active guide on vacation. There's so much to see when Zoe grows up a bit, Mom. And actually, that's not the point at all. Would you see yourself flying right now, not touching the ground, not pretending that you care about anything more than your love right now? It's not funny at all. It's completely normal, and we're all happy for you. Holly wrote a letter of resignation and worked out her 2 weeks. She tried to see her friends more often, at least for a little while, because soon they would have to see each other less often. Today after work, she ran through the stores, browsing through farewell New Year's gifts for her colleagues, and in the evening she waited for her friend to visit. She promised to bring a familiar master of wedding hairstyles, opposed to all kinds of glamour. The friend and now argued that you can go to the wedding even in overalls, but not to build a stylish romantic hairstyle of gorgeous long hair would be a crime. And that same night, the ex-husband showed up. I understand you were trying to escape your loneliness. Good for you. You've benefited from this incident. I mean, it's been good for both of us. You've blossomed. I've learned to appreciate what I have, not chase illusions. You know in your heart that it's not worth it to be adventurous at our age. We have too much in common. It won't be so hard for us to start over. By the way, I've almost finished the house. Just a few minor details. You'll like it. Maybe you could do some decorating tips, get involved. Well, we could live there and rent this place out. No more cramped quarters, there's views just a stone's throw away. Well, you probably remember. We'll go mushroom picking. You love mushrooms. In summer, we'll go to the sea on vacation, so no vegetable gardens. We can go together with young people or take our granddaughter, or just the two of us, to renew our feelings. It's all gone, honey. There's nothing to update, Holly said without a trace of gloating or irritation. I'm grateful to you for the good things we had, for our wonderful daughter. And for this incident, as you call it, too. Before this incident, I lived and did not even know what I could be, what a man could be with me, how happiness feels. I could have lived my whole life and never known it. You must really understand me. A year ago, you said something like that. I was wrong, you see. And you're not afraid of being wrong. I'm not, Holly smiled with quiet confidence. Ben's eyes glittered with the cold anger that had once robbed her of her will and strength, and she decided it was time to show him the door. She didn't feel like exchanging insults. They had absolutely no place in her current life. But Holly didn't have to do anything. She was saved by 4 short, cheerful rings at the door. She came in, and with her was a tall, thin girl in a cap with huge curls. Well, meet Alona, wedding fairy, stylist. And this is our bride. Oh, and this is her ex-husband, who came to privately congratulate and wish his ex-wife happiness in her new marriage. Very modern. Hello, Ben. The man grabbed his jacket off the rack and left the apartment without looking back. He didn't remember how he'd gotten outside, how he'd gotten home. Not far from home, he was stopped for speeding. My ex-wife left me, and I was on my way back to her. I thought she'd be happy. Forgive me. She's getting married in a year. So much for a woman's fidelity. She's a decent woman who had a home, a job, a granddaughter. What better person to talk to than anyone else? He had a desperate, sudden urge to speak out to someone he didn't know. The occasional hitchhiker effect, or whatever it's called. Could you breathe into a tube, please? At home, the man immediately called Jane, apologized for not calling for a long time, asked about his granddaughter, and when he could see them all. Maybe we can go together somewhere to the water park. Or what's your daughter's favorite? Dad, did something happen to you? My daughter asked right away. Yes, daughter. I need you to be my ally. There's no one else to talk your mom out of doing something stupid. Not so long ago, you were such a romantic, putting passion above all else. Her own daughter snickered with amusement. Ben told me all about Diane. Jan is a kind, impressionable girl who likes to pretend to be cynical sometimes, so that her kindness is not overused. She listened to her father attentively and seemed to really sympathize. Then Ben began to ask her to influence his mother. She is a clever woman, and a clever man learns from other people's mistakes. And didn't she want her mother and father to be together again? Daddy, she said softly, let's be honest. I'm a little past the age of teenage trauma that comes with parental divorce. Your marriage is over, isn't it? Well, you could have had someone else. I'm really sorry you got one. You're not the worst kind of woman to get a woman to notice you for more than a house and a paycheck. You're still pretty good. But if Mom agreed to come back to you now, that's what I'd call a mistake. That's when I'd talk her out of it. You lived with her because she was comfortable. She deserves to be loved, not just a comfortable, good wife. And now she has that, and I wish the same for you. I see. You get a share of the apartment. You don't need your father anymore. Right, little bitch? He dropped the call and disconnected the phone. He didn't want to get up in the morning. When you drink alone, for some reason the hangover is always harder than after the same dose of booze in a company gathered for a fun occasion. Probably the occasion also affects. Although smart doctors do not write about it anywhere. I wanted to send a message to the general that I was ill and needed 24 hours to recover. I remembered that today was a day off, fell asleep again, and slept for another 3 hours. After a contrast shower, I slowly began to regain consciousness and turned on my phone. I was used to being in responsible positions, that I always had to be in touch. Without communication, I felt disconnected from the world, afraid of missing something. He counted 13 unanswered calls, all to Diane. He must not have been too convincing when he kicked her out of his house. He just couldn't be rude to her. She's got some kind of special talent. Girls like that get away with anything, as long as there are fools like him in the world. Ben's thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It's her again. I can't run away from her like a kid. Just don't hang up the phone, begged a confused, melodic voice. Just listen to me. It may be important for you too. Yeah, it's going to be hard for you to come up with something new to hook me. Trust is lost. Let's not waste time. Don't just use platitudes like I'm pregnant. Try them on your other partners. But I'm really pregnant. The girl sobbed desperately into the phone. And I haven't had any other partners, no one but you. Well, there were some fantasies, but I didn't fulfill them. Who hasn't? I wouldn't dare cheat on you, I know myself. I really didn't know about the baby when you kicked me out. I felt sick yesterday, nauseous. I took a test, and I found out. You can take a DNA test and make sure it's your baby. Stop for a minute. I'm trying to get Ben to cut in. Do you want to have the baby? Yes, I do. It's about time. And I really want to. Do you need financial support for the baby? I need a father. He needs his dad. But what's the play for? I'm not acting. I really want things to work out between us. I promise I'll never lie to you. And with a baby, I won't have to do anything stupid. Mom raised Diane alone, called her princess, dressed her like a doll. She was good at sewing, worked convenient hours, and took sewing orders home. From the age of 3, she gave the girl to dance, took her to different circles. Except for dancing and singing, she showed no interest in anything. She also studied without much zeal, but went favorite with most teachers and often received a grade higher only for the charm and ability to raise the mood of the teacher. Mom saw all this, understood, and not at all upset that the daughter will not come out of Sofia Kovalevskaya or Margaret Thatcher. She clearly has a different fate, and let it be happy. The girl grew up very pretty and artistic, with a lovely dotty figure. She could have become an actress with such external data, but this requires determination, which she did not possess. She was only interested in what came her way, and the prospect of making an effort for her goal caused bouts of ennui. Yes, well, if it's so hard, we can do without it. And the only things that came into her hands were boys. A charming blonde with a beautiful figure and delicately misty, sly blue eyes imperceptibly became the center of any company, pushing aside both wittier and brighter in character girls. Her mother was afraid that her daughter would repeat her fate, spin some silly romance, imagine it to be the love of her life, and be left alone with a child. She insinuated her princess heartfelt and patiently, yes, money and connections I have no, and you do not have special abilities, the desire to achieve something to achieve. Well, no and no, what can you do? But you are beautiful and sweet, with an easy character. Everybody likes you. That's a great opportunity, too. We can't all be independent and self-sufficient. You need only once to arrange your woman's fate correctly, wisely choosing a husband who will not be a burden to you and take care of you, so that you do not spend your life in endless work, as I do. There's certainly nothing beautiful about IT. If algebra and English were given with difficulty, these suggestions of Mama's were understood with half a hint. Mom could have no fear. The daughter politely, sweetly, and even sympathetically blew off young men who could not offer a secure life. Some guys really liked, but the life of Mom and many women around her demonstrated the fact love is not for long, and then only struggle with life's problems together with someone or alone. She did not dream of conquering a real rich man, did not believe in such fairy tales. She was a very practical person. She would be satisfied with just a fairly well-to-do and firmly on his feet man, in respect of which you can be completely confident. She didn't go for casual flings so as not to spoil her reputation. It only seems like a big city, after all. By the age of 30, her experience consisted of only 2 lovers, both more or less exactly as she'd planned. In both cases, wives and underage children messed up the plans, Both wives were tenacious, unwilling to let their husbands go. They involved the whole family in the psychological treatment, blackmailed with children and division of property. OEA was losing. When she met Ben, she realized he was the one. He came to their flower boutique for an original bouquet for his boss's wife, to whom he was invited for her birthday. "This is not a corporate and personal holiday for loved ones," explained a polite man in a decent suit, so that she better understood what kind of bouquet was needed. She liked the visitor, she had her principles, and was squeamish about even promising options if the man didn't seem pleasant. Now she smiled and motioned that he would definitely come again. She'd been lucky, though. His daughter turned out to be grown and married, and his wife belonged to a type she didn't understand, but not a dangerous one. And now she was lucky again. It is only necessary to behave correctly, to finally grow up and submit to young fitness instructors and other entertainment seekers. A baby's not bad either. Now that's kids she really likes. James looked at his friend with his trademark wistfully ironic grin that people sometimes took offense to, but Ben didn't care right now. "What can I tell you?" James pondered aloud, leaning against the bar. "It's not the worst thing for you to do. The feeling of not being needed by anyone is probably much worse. Parents are gone. Ex-wife and daughter are happy without you. And then one day you're a young dad again. They say late fatherhood is the most realized." James raised his index finger admonishingly, then rubbed his forehead. "What if you have a son? You've always been jealous of me having 2 boys. You'll be the favorite authoritative dad, the big boss. I'm not encouraging you to live with his mom, although that's up to you. You can't just vaporize everything. I don't believe that. And you finding out what she's really like, that's not a bad thing. Anyway, I'm staying out of it." The friend went home in a cab, and the man decided to air his head a little from the brandy heaviness through the evening city. He was a little drunk after all, but not drunk enough to fall asleep anywhere. The bar where they were meeting was in the center, not far from the station square, quite aptly decorated for New Year's Eve. Ben was drawn there for some reason, stomping through the busy crowd. It looked as if some train had recently arrived. People with luggage were coming out into the square, chatting animatedly as they greeted them. And Holly. Suddenly his ex-wife came out wearing a dainty crimson coat, looking like a girl. She was gently held by the shoulders by a tall bearded man, and a lot of people were looking at them for some reason, though they were just walking along, talking and laughing quietly. Ben stopped under a streetlight, and they saw him. "Hi," Holly said quite nonchalantly. "Hi, heard about the wedding. Congratulations. I have a son on the way." "Wow, that's great." Her companion smiled broadly and openly. "Well, congratulations to you too." "Wow, thank you. Okay, I'm off to see the family." Ben waved his hand and quickly disappeared into the crowd. Who was this slightly inebriated knight of the sad image? Andrew asked, raising one eyebrow amusedly. "My ex-husband," Holly answered. "If he's not lying, I'm happy for him. But then I'm also happy for that simpleton. I owe him a lot, after all." Ben watched them get into the cab, talking and laughing, and when they were gone, he went to the station cab driver and gave him Diane's address.